The auction was on a Friday in October of 1968, on the Kemper farmstead outside Heartland, Iowa, and the serious buyers had come early because estate sales in Shelby County drew crowds when the equipment was worth looking at, and the Kemper place had reputation enough that men drove from 3 counties over to walk the lots before the auctioneer started calling numbers. The morning had been cold, 47 degrees at sunrise, and the sky held that flat gray quality that Iowa gets in autumn when the season is deciding whether to rain or just threaten. And the men who came to buy stood in clusters near the equipment sheds with coffee thermoses and clipboards, and the particular alertness of people who know that value and price are different things, and that the difference between them is where profit lies. Curtis Brennan arrived at 11:15 in the morning, which was late by the standards of the serious bidders who had been walking the lot since 8, but Curtis had not come for the serious equipment. He had come for what the serious buyers would walk past, for the things that would be sold after lunch when half the crowd had gone home, and the auctioneer was tired, and the remaining bidders were the kind of men who bought equipment by the pound for scrap value rather than by function. He parked his truck at the back of the field where the overflow vehicles were accumulating, and he took from the bench seat a metal clipboard that had been his since his Navy years, and a stopwatch that he kept in the glove box for reasons that would become clear to anyone who watched him work. And he walked toward the auction barn with the unhurried gait of a man who had already decided what he was looking for, and needed only to confirm that it was there. Curtis was 34 years old that October. He had been custom farming in Shelby County for 6 years with a single tractor, a 1947 Farmall H that he had bought in 1962, and maintained with the kind of attention that comes from having learned mechanical work in a place where failure means consequences, which in his case had been the engine room of a destroyer during his Navy service from 1952 to 1956. He was not a large man, 5'10" and lean in the way of people who work physically without ever quite eating enough, and he had the kind of face that photographs poorly because it registers nothing in stillness but becomes readable in motion, in the small adjustments around the eyes and mouth that indicate thought. He did not talk much. He had never talked much. In the 6 years he had been custom farming in Shelby County, he had built a reputation not for conversation, but for finishing contracts on time and leaving fields in better condition than he found them, which in the custom farming business was the only reputation that mattered. The Kemper lots were organized by value, which meant that the good equipment had been placed near the auction barn, where the crowd could gather, and the auctioneer could work efficiently, and the equipment that the estate considered marginal had been placed progressively farther from the barn in a sequence that was itself a kind of editorial comment on worth. Curtis walked past the good equipment without stopping. He walked past the International Harvester 1206 that would sell for $4,800 to a farmer from Cass County. He walked past the John Deere 4020 that would go for $5,200 to a dealer from Council Bluffs. He walked past the cultivators and the plows and the grain wagons that were drawing clusters of men who stood with hands in pockets and made the SMALL Chinese letter that precedes bidding, the kind of talk that is about weather and crop prices and never about the equipment itself, because to talk about the equipment is to reveal interest, and to reveal interest is to invite competition. Curtis walked to the back fence. There were 2 tractors parked there, side by side, facing the fence as though they had been positioned to look away from the auction. They were International Harvester machines, both of them, which Curtis could identify from 100 yards by the shade of red and the profile of the grill. As he got closer, the models became clear: a 1950 Farmall M and a 1953 Super M. The M was the smaller of the two, a row crop tractor that International Harvester had sold in enormous numbers in the post-war years when farmers were mechanizing, and the M had been the right size and price for operations that were stepping up from horses, but could not afford the larger machines. The Super M was the M's successor, introduced in 1952 with more horsepower and better hydraulics, and the features that the original M had lacked but that farmers had learned they needed. Both machines were old by 1968 standards. Both showed wear. Curtis stopped at the fence and clicked his stopwatch and began what he would later teach his son to call the assessment. It was 11:47 in the morning. The M was parked closer to him. Curtis walked around it once, a complete circuit, looking without touching. The sheet metal was dented along the left side where the tractor had been run into something, probably a gate post, probably at a moment when the operator had been thinking about something other than clearance. The rear tires were worn but not critically, the tread still visible in the center section, which meant they had been used on pavement more than was ideal, but were not yet at replacement. The exhaust stack had surface rust. The seat was wood, a board placed across the springs where the factory cushion had been, which meant either that the original seat had rotted and the owner had improvised, or that someone had removed the seat for use on another machine and never replaced it. Curtis noted all of this in the first circuit. Then he stopped at the left rear wheel and knelt. The axle housing showed a rust stain below the seal, a vertical streak perhaps 8 inches long that had the orange-brown color of old rust rather than the bright red of active corrosion. Curtis touched it with his index finger. The rust was dry. The stain was old. He stood and moved to the rear of the tractor and looked at the oil pan. There was a dent in the pan, a depression roughly the size of a fist that had deformed the metal but had not punctured it. Curtis reached into his jacket pocket and took out a wrench, a 3/4-inch combination wrench that he carried for exactly this purpose, and he tapped the wrench handle against the oil pan near the dent. The sound that came back was a hollow ring, the acoustic signature of intact metal rather than cracked. He tapped again in 3 more places around the dent. Hollow ring each time. The pan was dented but not cracked, which was the distinction that mattered. A dent was cosmetic. A crack was structural. He moved to the front of the M and placed his hands on the grill and pushed. The tractor rocked slightly on its springs. He walked to the right side and gripped the flywheel through the inspection cover opening and turned. The flywheel moved. The engine was not seized. Curtis turned the flywheel a full rotation, feeling the resistance pattern as each cylinder came up on compression. The resistance was even, present in all 4 cylinders, which meant the pistons were moving and the rings were sealing and the valves were closing. An engine with even compression across cylinders was an engine that could run. He turned the flywheel another rotation to confirm. Even resistance again. It was 11:52. 5 minutes elapsed. Curtis took a small notebook from his pocket and wrote, M, engine turns, even compression, oil pan dent cosmetic, rear axle seal leak old. He returned the notebook to his pocket and moved to the Super M. The Super M was larger and showed different kinds of wear. The hydraulic reservoir at the rear of the tractor was empty, the sight glass showing nothing, and the pump casing below the reservoir was dark with oil that had leaked and spread and dried into a black crust that covered the pump housing and ran down onto the frame rail. Curtis knelt and looked at the oil pattern. Fresh oil is amber and flows. Old oil is black and crusts. This oil was old, which meant the leak had been present for some time and had either been ignored or had defeated attempts at repair. He reached up and touched the pump casing. The oil residue was dry and hard. He moved his hand along the frame rail following the oil trail and found where it terminated, at a point approximately 6 inches below the pump, which told him the leak source was somewhere in that 6-inch vertical space. He stood and leaned over the tractor and looked down at the pump from above. The pump inlet fitting, the connection where the hydraulic line attached to the pump, was visible. Curtis could see that the fitting was oil-covered, but he could not see from this angle whether the oil was coming from the fitting or from the pump casing seal beneath it. He walked to his truck and retrieved a roll of paper towels that he kept in the toolbox and returned to the Super M and spent 10 minutes cleaning the pump casing and the inlet fitting and the surrounding frame area with solvent and paper towels until the metal was visible and the old oil residue was removed. When he was finished, he could see the pump casing clearly. The casing itself showed no cracks. The casing seal, the gasket that sealed the pump housing to the tractor frame, appeared intact from what he could see without disassembly. The inlet fitting was another matter. The fitting was a compression-style connection, a nut that threaded onto the pump body and compressed a ferrule onto the hydraulic line to create a seal. Curtis took his 3/4-inch wrench and placed it on the fitting nut and turned gently. The nut moved. It had been loose. He did not tighten it. He left it as he had found it because this was an assessment, not a repair, and because leaving evidence undisturbed was part of the method. But he noted in his mind that the fitting was loose, and that a loose fitting would leak, and that a leak from a loose fitting would produce exactly the oil pattern he had observed. Oil on the pump casing and frame rail originating from the fitting, rather than from a failed pump seal. A loose fitting was a $2 problem. A failed pump seal was an $80 problem. A destroyed pump from running without oil was a $340 problem. Curtis had just identified which problem he was looking at. It was 12:04. He had been assessing the Super M for 12 minutes. He moved to the front of the tractor and gripped the flywheel and turned. The flywheel rotated. The engine was not seized. He felt the compression pattern. Cylinders 1, 2, and 4 showed even resistance. Cylinder 3 showed slightly less resistance. Curtis turned the flywheel through 2 more rotations, paying attention to cylinder 3. The resistance was consistent, lower than the others but not absent. A cylinder with no compression indicated a burnt valve or broken rings. A cylinder with reduced but consistent compression indicated an adjustment issue, most commonly a rocker arm that had loosened and was not opening the valve to full lift. Curtis walked to the right side of the tractor and located the valve cover. The cover was held by 4 bolts. He did not have the correct wrench size in his pocket to remove the cover, but he could see that one of the valve cover bolts was backed out slightly, which suggested someone had been in the valve train recently and had not torqued the cover bolts properly on reassembly. He returned to his notebook and wrote, Super M, engine turns, compression low, cylinder 3 likely rocker adjustment, hydraulic leak likely, inlet fitting not pump failure, park brake status unknown. He checked his stopwatch. 12:10, 23 minutes total assessment time for both machines. Curtis stood between the 2 tractors and did the arithmetic that would determine whether he would bid. The M needed a rear axle seal, which was an $8 part, and 45 minutes of work if you had done it before, which Curtis had done 11 times on various IH models. The M needed a clutch disc, which he could verify by checking the inspection cover, but which he assumed needed replacement based on the tractor's age and the likelihood that a machine this old in this condition had not had the clutch serviced recently. A clutch disc was $18 from the IH dealer in Heartland and 3 hours of work. The M needed a seat, which could be fabricated or purchased depending on budget. The M needed paint, which was cosmetic and therefore optional. Total parts cost for the M, $26 plus seat. Total labor, 4 to 5 hours. Working value of a functional 1950 Farmall M in October 1968 in Shelby County, $400 to $450 depending on condition and buyer. The Super M needed its hydraulic system addressed, which would start with tightening the inlet fitting and refilling the reservoir and observing whether the leak stopped, which was a zero-cost diagnosis. If the fitting tightness solved the leak, parts cost would be $12 for a battery and $8 for 5 gallons of hydraulic oil. If the fitting did not solve the leak, the next step would be pump seal replacement, which was a $25 gasket kit and 6 hours of work. If the pump itself was damaged from running low on oil, replacement would be either a rebuild at $55 for a kit plus 8 hours of labor, or a used pump from salvage at $80 to $120. Curtis estimated worst-case parts cost for the Super M at $100 and best case at $20. Working value of a functional 1953 Super M in October 1968, $450 to $500. Combined working value of both machines if repaired, $850 to $950. Combined worst-case repair cost, $126 plus labor. Curtis did his own labor, so labor cost was zero in cash terms, though not in time, and time was a cost that had to be counted even if it was not paid in dollars. He estimated total time to repair both machines at 15 to 20 hours spread across weekends, which was time he had because October was after harvest and before the ground froze, and the custom farming season was in the quiet period where a man could spend evenings in the shop without losing income opportunity. He calculated his bid ceiling. Working value $900 minus worst case repair cost $126 equals $774 absolute ceiling, assuming zero margin for error. Curtis did not bid at absolute ceiling because absolute ceiling left no room for the unknowns that appear during repair, the hidden cracks, and the parts that have been modified by previous owners in ways that create new problems. He bid with margin. 20% margin was standard, which meant his actual ceiling was $620. But $620 assumed he was bidding alone, and if competition appeared, he would need to decide in the moment how much margin he was willing to give up. He looked at his stopwatch. 12:10. The auction would not reach these tractors until after lunch, probably 2 or 2:30 in the afternoon based on the number of lots ahead of them in the sequence. Curtis had 4 hours. He walked back to his truck and retrieved a thermos of coffee and a sandwich that his wife Judith had packed that morning, and he sat on the tailgate and ate and watched the auction proceed through the good equipment, while he waited for the moment when the crowd would thin and the auctioneer would reach lot 23. Roy Dietrich had walked these same 2 tractors at 10:15 that morning. Curtis had seen him from across the lot, had watched him approach the M and the Super M, and circle them once and stop and look and then walk away. Roy was 52 years old and had been custom farming in Shelby County for 18 years with an operation that was larger than Curtis's by every measure that custom farming used to count size. Roy contracted 800 acres to Curtis's 240. Roy ran 3 tractors to Curtis's 1. Roy had a shop building and a fuel tank and a parts inventory and relationships with every implement dealer within 50 miles. Roy Dietrich was what success looked like in the custom farming business in Shelby County in 1968, and what success looked like was a man who drove a new pickup truck and financed his equipment through the bank and talked with confidence about expansion plans at the county extension meetings. Curtis had watched Roy assess the 2 IH tractors in the time it took Curtis to walk from the auction barn to the back fence, which was perhaps 3 minutes, and Curtis had watched Roy shake his head and walk away and say something to the man standing next to him. Curtis had been too far away to hear what Roy said, but he had seen Roy's expression and the other man's laugh, and he had understood the substance of the communication even without the words. The substance was dismissal. Roy Dietrich had looked at the 2 tractors and concluded they were not worth his time. Curtis knew this because at 1:15, when Curtis was finishing his sandwich on the tailgate of his truck, he heard Roy's voice from 20 feet away. Roy was talking to the auctioneer, a man named Glenn Howell who had been running farm auctions in Shelby County for 30 years. Curtis was not part of the conversation, but the conversation was happening in the open air of the auction lot, and voices carried. Roy said, "What are you opening lot 23 at?" Glenn said, "The 2IH. I'm thinking 200, they're rough." Roy said, "They're parts machines. The Super M's got a blown hydraulic pump. That's $400 to rebuild right there. Engine on the M is probably cracked. You can see the oil pan's been hit. I'd scrap them both." Glenn said, "You interested?" Roy said, "Not at any price that makes sense. You'll be lucky to get scrap value." Glenn said, "All right, I'll call them as I see them." Curtis listened to this exchange while drinking coffee from his thermos, and he did not react to it, because reaction would have indicated interest, and interest was information that had value. He filed the exchange in his memory, with the notation that Roy Dietrich had spent 3 minutes looking at 2 tractors, and had concluded that the Super M had a blown hydraulic pump, and that the M had a cracked engine. Curtis had spent 23 minutes looking at the same 2 tractors, and had concluded that the Super M had a loose hydraulic fitting, and that the M had intact engine compression. The difference between 3 minutes and 23 minutes was the difference between $400 in assumed repair costs and $26 in actual repair costs. The difference between assumed and actual was the difference between walking away and bidding. Curtis finished his coffee and returned the thermos to the truck and walked back to the auction area. The crowd had thinned since morning. The serious buyers had taken their purchases and left. The remaining men were the ones who bought by weight or who were looking for something specific that had not yet come up in the rotation, or who had no particular purpose, and were simply there because Friday auctions were social events, and the county was small enough that a man could know most of the other men present. Curtis positioned himself near the back fence, where the 2IH tractors waited, and he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, and watched the auctioneer work through the lots that preceded 23. At 2:07 in the afternoon, Glenn Howell reached the back fence. There were perhaps 15 people in the area, some of whom were there because they had followed the auctioneer through his progression, and some of whom had walked over because they were curious what the old iron at the back would bring. Roy Dietrich was not among them. Roy had left at 1:30 after buying a grain wagon for his operation. Curtis had watched him load the wagon and drive away. Glenn stood between the 2 tractors and looked at the small crowd and said, "Lot 23, we've got 2 International Harvester tractors here, a 1950 M and a 1953 Super M, sold as is with no warranty. You've had all day to look at them." He paused and looked at the M, and then at the Super M, and Curtis could see Glenn deciding in real time whether to say something about their condition, and then deciding against it, because saying something would be editorializing, and an auctioneer's job was to facilitate the sale, not to provide commentary. Glenn said, "Opening at $200 for the pair." A man to Curtis's left, a farmer Curtis did not know, said, "$225. Another voice from the back, $250. Curtis waited. Bidding this early was a way to signal interest without committing, and signaling interest invited competition. The bid sat at $250 for 5 seconds. Glenn called, "I have $250, do I hear $275? Silence. Glenn called it again, $250 going once. Curtis said, $300. The man who had bid $250 turned and looked at Curtis. The crowd, small as it was, shifted attention. 300 was a number that indicated seriousness rather than casual interest. Glenn registered the bid and said, "I have 300, do I hear 325? The man who had bid $250 looked at the tractors again and then looked at Curtis and then said nothing. The silence extended. Glenn called, $300 going once, going twice. Curtis said, $380. There was a pause. Someone in the crowd laughed, not loudly but audibly. Glenn looked at Curtis and said, "You're bidding against yourself." Curtis said, "I'm bidding $380. Glenn paused again and then said, "All right, I have $380. Anyone else?" "No, sold to the gentleman in the brown jacket for $380. The small crowd dispersed. Glenn made a note on his clipboard and said to Curtis, "See the clerk for payment. You'll need to move them by Sunday." Curtis said, "I'll move them tomorrow." He walked to the auction clerk's table and wrote a check for $380 from the farm account and received a receipt and a bill of sale. The clerk said, "You need help loading." Curtis said, "I'll bring a trailer tomorrow." The clerk said, "They run." Curtis said, "They will." The man who had bid $250 approached Curtis as Curtis was walking back to his truck. The man said, "You know something about those tractors I don't." Curtis said, "I know what they need." The man said, "What do they need?" Curtis said, "Work." The man looked at him for a moment and then said, "Well, good luck with that." Curtis drove home. The farm was 6 miles east of Heartland, a rented property with a house and a barn and 80 acres of ground that Curtis did not farm himself but leased to a neighbor. Curtis used the barn for equipment storage and repair. The house was small, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a front room, and Judith had made it functional in the way that people make spaces functional when money is limited and function is the priority. Curtis parked the truck and went inside. Judith was at the kitchen table with the account ledger open in front of her, a green hardcover book with lined pages that she used to track every dollar that came into the farm account and every dollar that went out. She looked up when Curtis entered and said, "How was the auction?" Curtis said, "I bought 2 tractors." She said, "Which ones?" He said, "The 2 IH at the back fence, the M and the Super M." She said, "How much?" He said, $380. Judith looked at the ledger and ran her finger down the balance column and said, "That leaves $467 in checking. What's the repair cost?" Curtis sat down at the table and took out his small notebook and opened it to the page where he had written his assessment notes. He said, "The M needs a rear axle seal, $8. Clutch disc, $18. The Super M needs hydraulic oil and a battery, $20, assuming the leak is the inlet fitting, which I think it is. If it's not, worst case is a pump rebuild, $55. Judith took a pencil and did the arithmetic on a piece of scrap paper. She said, "Worst case is $101. That leaves $366 operating margin. When do you need to repair them?" Curtis said, "No deadline. I can work on them through winter." She said, "What's the return?" He said, "If they're both running by spring, I can double my capacity. I can take on more acres. I estimate 400 to 500 additional gross income for the '69 season." Judith studied the numbers and then looked at Curtis and said, "That's a 1-season payback." He said, "If the repair cost stays at worst case or below." She said, "And if it doesn't?" He said, "Then it takes longer." She wrote the $380 expense in the ledger under equipment purchases and updated the balance. She said, "We're tight until spring billing comes in. No equipment purchases between now and April unless something breaks that we can't work around." Curtis said, "Understood." She said, "Show me what you're going to do with them." Curtis opened his notebook and walked her through his assessment notes, the compression test results, the hydraulic leak diagnosis, the parts list and labor estimate for each machine. Judith listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she said, "You're assuming the hydraulic pump isn't damaged." He said, "I'm assuming the leak is external because the oil pattern suggests external, and because Dietrich assumed internal without checking." She said, "What if Dietrich was right?" Curtis said, "Then I'll rebuild the pump. I've done it before." She said, "When?" He said, 62, on the H. Judith closed the ledger and said, "All right, approved, but document everything. I want receipts for every part and a time log for every hour you spend. If this turns into a money pit, I want to know where the money went." Curtis said, "I'll document it." That evening after dinner, Curtis walked out to the barn where his 1947 Farmall H sat in the work bay, the tractor that had been his only machine for 6 years, and that had earned every dollar that had come into the farm account from custom work since 1962. He stood looking at the H for a moment, and then he opened a drawer in the workbench and took out a new spiral notebook, the kind that cost 35 cents at the general store, and he opened it to the first page and wrote at the top in block letters, "Equipment Capital, Account 1968. Below that he wrote, "October 18, 1968. Opening balance from farm checking account, $673. Purchase, Lot 23 Kemper Auction 2 IH tractors 1950M and 1953 Super M, total cost $380. Remaining balance $293. Estimated repair cost, M $26, Super M $20 to $55. Estimated working value after repair, M $420, Super M $480. Total working value, $900. Capital invested, $380 plus repairs equals $406 to $441. Margin, $459 to $494. He paused and then wrote below that, methodology, assessment time minimum 20 minutes per machine. Dietrich assessment time observed 3 minutes. Information advantage, 17 minutes. Value advantage identified, approximately $220 per machine based on repair cost differential between assumed damage and actual damage. Conclusion, time spent in assessment equals money not spent in error. Curtis numbered the page and turned to the second page and wrote, Rule 1. Never buy what you have not assessed minimum 20 minutes. Rule 2. Never buy what you cannot repair with documented knowledge. Rule 3. Never finance what you can buy with cash. He closed the notebook and placed it on the workbench, and stood there in the barn with the single overhead light making shadows on the walls and the October cold coming through the gaps in the siding. Tomorrow, he would borrow a trailer from Frank Morrow, the retired IH mechanic who lived 4 miles north and who had taught Curtis most of what he knew about IH hydraulics. Tomorrow, he would drive back to the Kemper place and load the 2 tractors and bring them home. Tomorrow, the work would begin. But tonight, there was only the notebook and the rules written in it, and the knowledge that somewhere in Shelby County Roy Dietrich was at home believing that Curtis Brennan had just bought $380 worth of parts machines, while Curtis sat in his barn, knowing that he had bought $900 worth of working tractors for less than half their value. The difference was 20 minutes. The difference was always 20 minutes. Michael Brennan was 13 years old in October of 1968, and he was the kind of boy who asked questions about how things worked, which meant that when his father came home and told him about the 2 tractors, Michael's first question was not why did you buy them but what's wrong with them. Curtis appreciated this about his son, the instinct to ask about mechanism rather than motivation, and that evening after Curtis had written his first entries in the equipment capital account ledger, he called Michael out to the barn and showed him the notebook. Michael read the first page and said, "What does information advantage mean?" Curtis said, "It means I knew something Dietrich didn't know." Michael said, "What did you know?" Curtis said, "I knew the Super M's hydraulic leak was probably a loose fitting instead of a blown pump." Michael said, "How did you know that?" Curtis said, Because I spent 20 minutes cleaning the oil off the pump and looking at where the leak was coming from. Dietrich spent 3 minutes and assumed worst case. Michael said, "What if you're wrong?" Curtis said, "Then I fix the pump, but I'm not wrong." Michael said, "How do you know you're not wrong?" Curtis took Michael out to the truck and drove back to the Kemper place even though it was nearly dark, and even though the auction was over and the lots were empty. He parked near the back fence and took a flashlight from the glove box and walked Michael to where the Super M still sat waiting to be moved. Curtis shined the flashlight on the hydraulic pump and showed Michael the inlet fitting and explained how a compression fitting worked and how a loose fitting would weep oil and how the oil would run down the pump casing and create the exact pattern they were looking at. He said Dietrich saw oil on the pump and assumed the pump was leaking. He didn't look at where the oil was coming from. He didn't ask if there was another explanation. He saw a symptom and assumed the worst diagnosis because the worst diagnosis justified walking away. Michael said, "But you didn't walk away." Curtis said, "Because I looked for 20 minutes instead of 3, and in those 20 minutes I found the real problem." He handed Michael the flashlight and said, "Look at the fitting. Tell me what you see." Michael leaned in and looked and said, "It's loose." Curtis said, "How do you know?" Michael said, "Because there's oil around it, and because when I look close I can see it's not tight against the pump." Curtis said, "Good. Now you know what I knew, and that's why I bid $380 when Dietrich walked away." They drove home and Curtis parked the truck, and before they went inside Curtis said, "Tomorrow we bring them home. This weekend we start repairs. You're going to help. You're going to learn what 20 minutes buys." Michael said, "What does it buy?" Curtis said, "The difference between profit and loss." Saturday morning, Curtis borrowed a tandem axle equipment trailer from Frank Morrow, and he and Michael drove to the Kemper place and loaded the 2 IH tractors using a rented come-along and a system of chains that Curtis had used before, and that worked because physics worked regardless of whether you had expensive equipment. The M loaded first, pulled up the ramps with the come-along hooked to the front axle, and the Super M followed. Curtis chained both machines to the trailer and checked the chains twice, and then drove home at 40 miles per hour, because the trailer had no brakes, and 40 miles per hour was the speed at which Curtis could stop the truck and trailer combination without losing control. They unloaded the tractors at the barn using the same come-along system in reverse, and Curtis parked them side by side in the work bay and stood back and looked at them. Michael stood next to him. Curtis said, "2 tractors, $760 combined working value if we repair them correctly, $380 purchase price, estimated $100 repair cost, net margin $480. That margin only exists if we do the work right." Michael said, "What if we mess up?" Curtis said, "Then we learn what we did wrong and we don't do it again. But we won't mess up because we're going to follow the manual, and we're going to document everything, and we're going to check our work before we call it done." He walked to the workbench and retrieved the equipment capital account notebook and opened it to a new page and wrote, October 19, 1968. Tractors acquired and delivered to barn. Assessment begins. He handed the notebook to Michael and said, "You're going to keep the repair log. Every part we buy, every hour we work, every measurement we take. You write it down. That way, when we're done, we'll know exactly what it cost and exactly what we did. And if something goes wrong later, we'll have a record to compare against." Michael took the notebook and said, "What do I write first?" Curtis said, "Write this. Day 1. Visual inspection and initial assessment. M. Rear axle seal leak, clutch disc worn, seat missing, oil pan dent cosmetic. Super M. Hydraulic leak source to be determined, compression low cylinder 3, park brake frozen. Michael wrote, and when he was done, Curtis checked what he had written and nodded and said, "Good. Now we make a plan." They spent the rest of Saturday afternoon making the plan, which meant Curtis walking Michael through each repair in sequence, explaining what needed to be done and why, and what tools would be required, and what the decision points were, the moments in a repair where you learn something that changes what you do next. Curtis had learned to plan repairs this way in the Navy, in the engine room of the destroyer, where a failed repair could mean a dead ship in hostile water, and where the chief machinist's mate had drilled into every mechanic the necessity of thinking 3 steps ahead. You don't start a job until you know how it ends. You don't take something apart until you know you can put it back together. You don't guess when you can measure. These principles had kept Curtis alive in the Navy, and they had kept his equipment running for 6 years of custom farming, and they were the principles he was now teaching his son. By the time they finished planning, it was dark outside and the barn was cold, and Judith called them in for dinner. They ate, and afterward Curtis sat in the front room with the Sears catalog open to the farm equipment section, and he made a list of the parts he would need to order. Rear axle seal for the M, $8.40 including shipping. Clutch disc, $17.75. Hydraulic oil, 5 gallons, $8.20. Battery for the Super M, $11.95. He added the numbers, $46.30, assuming the hydraulic leak was the fitting and not the pump. He checked the farm account balance in his head. $467 minus $46 equals $421. Margin sufficient. He wrote the order on a Sears order form and addressed an envelope and put a check in the mail Monday morning. The parts would arrive in 7 to 10 days. In the meantime, there was other work to do, the kind of work that required no parts, only time and attention. Curtis spent Monday evening in the barn with the M, draining the rear axle housing and inspecting the gear oil that came out. The oil was dark but not metallic, which meant the gears were not shedding material, which meant they were not worn beyond serviceability. He set the oil aside to dispose of later and cleaned the housing drain plug and set it aside and moved to the clutch inspection cover. The cover was held by 6 bolts. Curtis removed them and pulled the cover and shined his flashlight into the clutch housing. The pressure plate was visible, a heavy cast iron disc with spring fingers that pressed the clutch disc against the flywheel. Curtis could see that the pressure plate surface was scored but not cracked. The clutch disc itself was worn down to the rivets, the friction material almost completely gone. This was expected. A 13-year-old tractor that had been worked hard would have a worn clutch. Curtis replaced the inspection cover and moved to the Super M. He filled the hydraulic reservoir with water, not oil, because water was free and this was a test, not a repair. He started the engine, which ran on magneto ignition and did not require a battery. The engine fired and settled into a rough idle. Curtis let it warm and then operated the hydraulic control lever. The hydraulic cylinder that he had connected to the system for testing extended 3 inches and stopped. Curtis watched the pump area. Water began seeping from the inlet fitting. He shut the engine down and drained the water from the reservoir and took his 3/4-inch wrench and tightened the inlet fitting 1/4 turn. He refilled the reservoir with water and started the engine again and operated the lever. The cylinder extended 6 inches this time before stopping. The leak at the fitting had slowed but not stopped. Curtis tightened the fitting another 1/4 turn and repeated the test. This time the cylinder extended fully, and no water appeared at the fitting. He shut the engine down and drained the water and stood looking at the pump. The leak had been the fitting, not the pump seal, not the pump itself. A $2 problem, not a $300 problem. Roy Dietrich had walked away from this tractor because he had assumed $300. Curtis had bought it because he had checked. He walked to the workbench and opened the equipment capital account notebook and wrote, October 21, 1968. Super M hydraulic diagnosis complete. Leak source confirmed as inlet fitting. Repair. Tighten fitting. Replace hydraulic oil. Install battery. Estimated parts cost revised down from $55 to $20. Total estimated repair cost both tractors now $66. Michael came out to the barn after school Tuesday and Curtis showed him what he had found and explained the test procedure and the logic behind using water instead of oil for leak testing. Michael asked questions and Curtis answered them, and then Curtis said, "Tomorrow the parts arrive. This weekend we do the repairs. You're going to do the work. I'm going to supervise. That's how you learn." The parts arrived Thursday. Curtis checked each item against the order form and checked the prices against what he had calculated and filed the receipt in the equipment folder that Judith maintained for tax purposes. Saturday morning he and Michael began the repairs. The M went first because the axle seal was the simpler job, and Curtis wanted Michael to succeed on something straightforward before moving to the more complex clutch replacement. Curtis showed Michael how to position a drain pan and how to remove the axle retaining bolts in sequence, and how to pull the axle using a slide hammer that Curtis had fabricated from pipe and a weight. The old seal came out and the new seal went in, and Michael did the work while Curtis watched and corrected and explained. They refilled the rear housing with fresh gear oil and replaced the drain plug, and Curtis had Michael check for leaks while he held a flashlight. No leaks. The seal was seated correctly. The clutch took longer because the clutch required removing the transmission from the tractor to access the pressure plate, and removing the transmission required supporting the rear of the tractor with jack stands, and unbolting the transmission housing and sliding the transmission back on a creeper, while guiding the input shaft out of the pilot bearing. Curtis had done this work before, but Michael had not, and Curtis made Michael do each step, while he explained what could go wrong and how to prevent it. They worked through Saturday afternoon and into evening, and by the time they finished installing the new clutch disc and reassembling the transmission, it was dark and cold, and Michael's hands were shaking from cold and effort. Curtis said, "Start it." Michael climbed into the seat and turned the key. The M's engine cranked and fired and settled into a steady idle. Curtis said, "Put it in gear." Michael engaged the clutch and shifted into first gear and released the clutch pedal. The M rolled forward. Michael pressed the clutch and the tractor stopped. Curtis said, "Again." Michael repeated the sequence 5 times, engaging and disengaging the clutch, and each time the clutch worked smoothly without slipping. Curtis said, "Good, shut it down." Michael shut the engine off and climbed down, and Curtis said, "The M is done. $68 in parts, 12 hours of work. It's worth $420 now. You just made $352. Michael said, "We made it." Curtis said, "You made it, I watched." They worked on the Super M Sunday morning, installing the battery and filling the hydraulic reservoir with oil and testing the system under load. The hydraulic cylinder extended and retracted smoothly with no leaks at the inlet fitting. Curtis checked the valve train and adjusted the rocker arm on cylinder 3 and retested the compression, even across all 4 cylinders now. The Super M was complete. Curtis updated the equipment capital account ledger that evening. Total parts cost, $68 for the M, $23 for the Super M, $91 total, $10 under worst-case estimate. Total capital invested, $380 purchase plus $91 repair equals $471. Combined working value, $840. Margin, $369. Return on investment, 78%. He showed the numbers to Judith, and she reviewed them and said, "You were right about the hydraulic pump. He said, "I knew I was right." She said, "How?" He said, "Because I looked." Curtis closed the notebook and placed it in the desk drawer, and sat for a moment thinking about Roy Dietrich, and the 3 minutes Roy had spent assessing 2 tractors that were now sitting in Curtis's barn fully functional, and worth more than twice what Curtis had paid for them. Curtis had no particular feeling about Roy beyond a mild curiosity about what else Roy might walk away from in the future that Curtis might buy. This was not vindication. This was not revenge. This was simply the working out of a principle that Curtis had learned in the Navy and had applied in civilian life. You do the work. You check your assumptions. You document your results. And when you are done, you know whether you were right or wrong, and if you were wrong, you learn from it, and if you were right, you do it again. Curtis had been right. The method worked. And in the spring of 1969, when the weather window opened and the planting season began, Curtis Brennan would have 3 tractors instead of 1, and he would be able to take on twice the contracted acres he had worked in 1968, and the income from those additional acres would go into the equipment capital account, and the cycle would begin again. Roy Dietrich had walked away from that cycle when he walked away from 2 tractors at the back fence of the Kemper auction lot in October of 1968. Curtis had walked toward it. And that difference, the difference between 3 minutes and 23 minutes, the difference between assumption and verification, would become over the next 23 years the difference between survival and failure in Shelby County, Iowa. But in October of 1968, none of that was visible yet. In October of 1968, there were only 2 tractors in a barn, and a notebook with rules written in it, and a man who believed that broken things could be fixed if you knew how to look at them. The rest would come later. The rest would come from the looking. The winter came early to Shelby County in 1968. The first hard freeze arrived on November 7th, 3 weeks ahead of the average date, and by the middle of the month the ground was locked solid, and the custom farming season was closed until spring thaw. This was the quiet time in the agricultural calendar, the months when equipment sat idle and farmers turned their attention to maintenance and repair, and the kind of planning that required looking at numbers rather than fields. For Curtis Brennan, it was the season when the real work began, the work that happened in the barn with a halogen work light and a service manual, and the patience that separates the men who fix things from the men who pay others to fix things for them. The barn was not insulated, and in November the temperature inside tracked within 5 degrees of the temperature outside, which meant that on the coldest nights, Curtis worked in conditions that hovered just above freezing. He had a space heater, a kerosene unit that Frank Morrow had given him when Frank upgraded to a propane furnace, and Curtis positioned the heater near the work bay, where the 2 International Harvester tractors sat waiting for his attention. The heater produced enough warmth to keep his fingers functional and enough light to supplement the single overhead bulb, and Curtis worked in the small circle of heat and illumination, while the rest of the barn remained dark and cold around him. He began with the Farmall M because the M was the simpler machine, and because starting with success builds confidence for harder work. The M needed a clutch replacement and a rear axle seal, and these were repairs that Curtis had done before on similar equipment. Michael came to the barn after school most days, and Curtis put him to work organizing the tools and parts on a sheet of plywood laid across 2 sawhorses, a system Curtis had developed years before because organization was efficiency, and efficiency was time, and time was the resource that could not be bought or borrowed. Every socket had a position. Every wrench had a place. When a tool was used, it returned to its position so that the next time it was needed, Curtis did not waste minutes searching. Michael learned this system by repetition, by being corrected when he placed a tool in the wrong position, by hearing his father say the same instruction until the instruction became automatic. A disorganized work area produces mistakes. Mistakes produce failures. Failures produce costs. The clutch replacement on the M took 3 evenings across the second week of November. Curtis showed Michael how to support the rear of the tractor with jack stands, testing each stand twice before trusting weight to it, because a tractor that falls kills the man underneath it, and there is no appeal from that judgment. He showed Michael how to drain the transmission housing and how to catch the oil in a pan that was large enough to hold what came out, because spilled oil on a concrete floor is a waste and a hazard both. He showed Michael how to remove the transmission in sequence, each bolt marked with chalk so that reassembly would follow the reverse order, each bolt inspected for thread damage before being set aside. When the transmission was separated from the engine, Curtis showed Michael the clutch assembly. The pressure plate was a heavy casting with 6 spring fingers that pressed the clutch disc against the flywheel, and Curtis explained how the springs provided the force, and how the release bearing moved the fingers, and how the geometry of the system converted the linear motion of the clutch pedal into the rotational engagement of the disc. Michael asked questions and Curtis answered them, and when Michael understood the mechanism, Curtis said, "Now you rebuild it." Michael was 14 years old, and he had been watching his father work on equipment since he was old enough to stand in the barn. But watching was not the same as doing, and doing for the first time carried a weight that watching did not. Curtis handed him the clutch disc, the new one from the Sears shipment, and said, "Install it." Michael held the disc and looked at the pressure plate and said, "Which way does it face?" Curtis said, "Look at the old one." Michael looked at the worn disc that Curtis had removed and saw that one side was smooth and one side had the friction material, what was left of it, and he understood that the friction side faced the flywheel. He positioned the new disc against the flywheel, and Curtis said, "How are you going to hold it there while you install the pressure plate?" Michael did not know. Curtis reached into the toolbox and pulled out a clutch alignment tool, a shaft that fit through the center of the disc and into the pilot bearing, and held the disc centered while the pressure plate bolts were tightened. He handed the tool to Michael and said, "Figure it out." Michael worked through the problem, fitting the alignment tool, positioning the pressure plate over the disc, starting the 6 bolts by hand before using the wrench to tighten them. Curtis watched and corrected when Michael started to tighten the bolts in a circle pattern and said, "Star pattern, opposite bolts, even pressure." Michael adjusted and tightened the bolts in the sequence Curtis indicated, and when all 6 were snug, Curtis said, "Now torque them to spec." Michael said, "What's the spec?" Curtis walked to the workbench and retrieved a photocopied manual, pages stapled together. The photocopy made at the Heartland Public Library from the reference section's International Harvester Service Manual collection. He opened to the clutch section and pointed to the torque specification, 35 foot-pounds. Curtis handed Michael the torque wrench and watched as Michael set the wrench to 35 and applied it to each bolt in the star pattern until the wrench clicked. When all 6 bolts were torqued, Michael looked at Curtis and Curtis said, "Check them again." Michael checked them again. All 6 clicked at 35. Curtis said, "Good, now we reassemble." They reassembled the transmission to the engine, reversing the disassembly sequence, and when the last bolt was tight, Curtis had Michael refill the transmission with gear oil, measuring the quantity, checking the level through the sight glass. Curtis started the engine and let it warm and then had Michael engage the clutch. The M rolled forward smoothly. Curtis said, "Again." Michael repeated the engagement 5 times, and each time the clutch caught without slipping and without noise. Curtis shut the engine down and said, "You just rebuilt a clutch. Next time it will take you half as long because you will know what you are doing before you start." The rear axle seal was a simpler repair, completed in a single evening, and by November 23rd the Farmall M was fully operational. Curtis updated the equipment capital account ledger with the actual costs. Clutch disc $17.75, rear axle seal $8.40, gear oil for both transmission and rear housing $6.30, total $32.45. He had estimated $26, so he was $6.45 over estimate. But the overage was acceptable because the estimate had been conservative, and because being under budget on one repair meant nothing if the next repair exceeded budget by more. What mattered was the total, and the total would not be known until both tractors were finished. Curtis moved to the Super M on the Monday after Thanksgiving. The Super M presented a different category of problem than the M had presented because the Super M's primary issue was the hydraulic system, and hydraulic systems were more complex than clutches. A clutch was mechanical, a matter of springs and friction and geometry. A hydraulic system was fluid dynamics, pressure and flow, and the invisible forces that moved oil through lines and valves and cylinders to produce work. Curtis had rebuilt hydraulic pumps before, but not frequently, and the Super M's pump was a model he had not worked on specifically. He would need a manual. The Heartland Public Library did not have a service manual for the 1953 Super M in its reference collection. Curtis checked on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, walking the aisles of the agriculture section, finding manuals for the M and the H and the later model Super MTA, but nothing for the 1953 Super M standard. The librarian, a woman named Margaret who had worked at the library for 18 years and who knew the collection the way Curtis knew IH equipment, said, "We had it once, but it was checked out in '64 and never returned. You could try the implement dealer." Curtis drove to the International Harvester dealer in Heartland, a business called Timmons Implement that occupied a metal building on the east side of town. The parts counter was managed by a man named Ed Timmons, the owner's son, who was Curtis's age and who had sold Curtis parts before, and who knew that Curtis paid cash and did not waste time. Curtis said, "I need a service manual for a '53 Super M." Ed said, "I can order one from Regional. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Cost is $12. Curtis said, "I need it sooner." Ed said, "Then you need to find one somewhere else because we don't stock manuals for 20-year-old machines." Curtis drove home, and that evening he told Judith that he needed to go to Iowa City, which was 80 miles east and which had the University of Iowa Library. Judith said, "When?" Curtis said, "Tomorrow." She said, "That's 3 hours driving round trip plus however long you spend there." He said, "I need the manual. I can't rebuild the pump without the torque specifications." She said, "Can you wait until Saturday? I need the truck Friday for groceries." Curtis said, "I'll take the H." Judith looked at him and said, "You're going to drive a tractor 80 miles in December." He said, "It runs. Roads are clear." She said, "Curtis, it will take you 6 hours round trip on a tractor." He said, "Then I leave early." Thursday morning Curtis woke at 4:30 and dressed in layers, thermal underwear and work pants and 2 shirts and a coat and a wool cap that covered his ears. He started the Farmall H and let it warm while he filled a thermos with coffee and wrapped 2 sandwiches that Judith had made the night before. The temperature was 19 degrees. The H had no cab, just a metal seat and a steering wheel and the open air around the operator. And Curtis knew from experience that 6 hours of riding in 19-degree air would reduce body temperature to the edge of hypothermia if he was not careful. He climbed onto the H and drove out of the farmyard at 5 in the morning, with the headlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness and the engine noise loud in the cold air. The drive to Iowa City took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Curtis stopped once at a gas station outside of Grinnell to warm his hands and refill the thermos. The attendant looked at the tractor and said, "You break down." Curtis said, "No, going to Iowa City." The attendant said, "On that." Curtis said, "It runs." The attendant shook his head and went back inside. Curtis finished his coffee and drove the remaining 40 miles to Iowa City, arriving at the university library at 9 in the morning. He parked the H in the visitor lot and walked into the library and found the agriculture section on the second floor. The service manual he needed was there, a thick binder with International Harvester printed on the spine, and Curtis carried it to a table and opened it to the hydraulic pump section. The manual was detailed, with exploded diagrams and part numbers and the torque specifications for every bolt in the pump assembly. Curtis read through the procedure twice to ensure he understood the sequence, and then he went to the reference desk and asked if he could photocopy the pages. The librarian said, 10 cents per page. Curtis counted the pages he needed. 47, $4.70. He paid and spent the next 30 minutes at the photocopy machine, copying each page, checking each copy to ensure the diagrams were clear and the text was readable. When he finished, he had a complete reproduction of the hydraulic pump rebuild section, stapled together, and he carried it out of the library and secured it in the H's toolbox and began the drive home. He arrived back at the farm at 3 in the afternoon, cold and stiff, and tired from 7 hours on an open tractor in December air. Judith met him at the barn and said, "You look half frozen." Curtis said, "I got the manual." She said, "Was it worth 7 hours?" He said, "It has the torque specs. Without those, I would ruin the pump." She said, "Come inside, I made soup." Curtis ate and warmed, and that evening he sat at the kitchen table with the photocopied manual and read through the procedure again, making notes in the margins, highlighting the critical steps, the moments where error would cascade into failure. A hydraulic pump rebuild required disassembly in a specific sequence because the internal geometry made certain components inaccessible until others were removed. The pump housing had to be separated from the tractor frame. The drive shaft had to be pulled. The gears had to be extracted without damaging the housing. Each gear had wear limits, measured in thousandths of an inch, and the wear had to be checked with a micrometer against the specifications in the manual. If the wear exceeded spec, the gear was replaced. If it was within spec, the gear was reused. The seals and gaskets were always replaced regardless of condition, because seals and gaskets were the failure points in any hydraulic system, and new seals cost dollars while seal failure cost days. Curtis ordered the rebuild kit from Timmons Implement the next morning. The kit included all seals, all gaskets, and the O-rings that sealed the internal passages. Ed Timmons said the kit would arrive from the regional warehouse in 2 to 3 weeks. Curtis said, "Let me know when it comes in." The kit arrived on December 18th. Curtis picked it up and brought it home, and that evening he began the Super M hydraulic pump rebuild. Michael assisted, holding the flashlight, organizing parts as Curtis removed them, writing in the repair log that Curtis had designated as Michael's responsibility. The log was a separate notebook from the equipment capital account ledger, a composition book with numbered pages, and every part that came off the Super M was documented with a number that corresponded to its position in the disassembly sequence, so that reassembly would be possible without guessing. The pump disassembly took 2 evenings. Curtis worked slowly, checking each step against the manual measuring gear wear with the micrometer that Frank Morrow had loaned him. The gears showed wear, but the wear was within specification. The housing showed no scoring. The drive shaft showed no cracks. Everything was reusable except the seals and gaskets, which Curtis had expected. He cleaned each component with solvent and a wire brush and set them in order on the plywood workbench surface. Reassembly began on December 21st. Curtis followed the manual in reverse sequence, installing the gears, seating the seals, torquing the housing bolts to the specification printed in the manual, 35 foot-pounds in a star pattern. He worked through the evening and into the night, and Michael stayed with him, watching, asking questions when he did not understand, remaining silent when Curtis needed to concentrate. At 11:30, Curtis installed the last bolt and torqued it and set the wrench down and said, "That is how you rebuild a hydraulic pump." Michael said, "How do you know it works?" Curtis said, "We test it." The test required installing the pump on the Super M and filling the hydraulic reservoir with oil and starting the engine and operating the hydraulic control to see if the pump produced pressure. Curtis did not have hydraulic oil in the barn. Hydraulic oil was $8 for 5 gallons, and Curtis did not want to spend $8 on oil that might leak out if he had made an error in the rebuild. He filled the reservoir with water instead. Water was free, and water would reveal leaks the same as oil. He started the Super M's engine, and it fired and settled into the rough idle that magneto-ignition engines have when they are cold. Curtis let it warm and then operated the hydraulic control lever. The test cylinder he had connected extended 3 inches and stopped. Curtis watched the pump. Water began seeping from the inlet fitting that he had tightened during his initial assessment. He shut the engine down and tightened the fitting another quarter turn and restarted and tested again. The cylinder extended 6 inches. The seep slowed. Another quarter turn on the fitting. Another test. The cylinder extended fully and no water appeared anywhere in the system. Curtis shut the engine down and drained the water from the reservoir and stood looking at the pump. The rebuild was successful. The leak had been the fitting, exactly as he had diagnosed during his 23-minute assessment at the Kemper auction 2 months before. He walked to the workbench and updated the equipment capital account ledger. December 21, 1968. Super M hydraulic pump rebuild complete. Parts cost: rebuild kit $55, hydraulic oil $8.20, battery $11.95. Total $75.15. Labor, 14 hours. He had estimated $20 to $55 depending on whether the leak was external or required pump rebuild. Actual cost was $75 because the fitting had not been the only issue. The pump had needed rebuilding because it had run low on oil for long enough to wear the seals beyond serviceability. But $75 was still less than the $340 that a new pump would have cost, and the knowledge Curtis had gained from doing the rebuild himself was worth more than the cost difference because knowledge was the asset that transferred to the next repair. Curtis closed the ledger and looked at the total capital invested in both tractors. Farmall M, $32.45. Super M, $75.15. Combined, $107.60. Purchase price, $380. Total capital, $487.60. Estimated combined working value, $840. Margin, $352.40. He showed these numbers to Judith that night, and she reviewed them and said, "You are under budget from your original estimate." Curtis said, "I estimated worst case at $126. Actual was $107.60. Judith said, "What changed?" He said the M came in under estimate. The Super M came in over. The total was under. She said, "When do you test them under load?" Curtis said, "When the ground thaws and I can get them into a field." She said, "That is 4 months away." He said, "Then we maintain them until spring." Through January and February of 1969, Curtis maintained both tractors in the barn, starting them weekly, checking fluid levels, greasing zerks, adjusting tensions. Michael learned the maintenance routine by doing it under Curtis's supervision, and by the middle of February Michael could perform a complete maintenance check without Curtis watching. This was the goal, to transfer the knowledge from father to son so that when Curtis was occupied elsewhere the machines would not sit idle for lack of attention. A tractor that is maintained weekly will run for decades. A tractor that is neglected will fail at the moment it is most needed. Curtis had learned this in the Navy, where equipment failure in combat was not an inconvenience but a death sentence. And the lesson had transferred to civilian life, where equipment failure in planting season was not death but was loss, which in farming was sometimes the same thing. On the first Saturday in March, when the temperature reached 46 degrees and the frost was coming out of the ground in patches, Curtis hitched the Farmall M to a disc harrow and took it to a 40-acre field that he had contracted to prepare for a farmer named Clayton Morris. Clayton's ground was heavy clay, difficult to work, the kind of soil that required multiple passes to break up and that tested equipment thoroughly. Curtis ran the M across 20 acres that afternoon, watching the tractor's performance, listening to the engine, feeling the clutch engagement, monitoring the oil pressure gauge that he had installed to replace the broken gauge that had come with the tractor. The M performed without fault. The engine pulled steadily under load. The clutch did not slip. The rear axle seal showed no leaks. Curtis finished the 20 acres and drove the M back to the barn and checked every fluid level and found them unchanged. He updated the repair log, March 8, 1969. M field test 20 acres disc harrow, performance nominal, no issues. The following Saturday he took the Super M to the same field and ran it across the remaining 20 acres. The Super M had more horsepower than the M and pulled the disc more aggressively, covering the ground faster. The hydraulic system lifted the disc at the end of each pass and lowered it for the return pass without hesitation. Curtis worked through the afternoon, and when he finished he parked the Super M and checked the hydraulic reservoir. The level had not dropped. The pump had held pressure. The rebuild was validated. He returned to the barn and found Michael waiting. Curtis said, "Both tractors work. We have tripled capacity." Michael said, "Tripled." Curtis said, "The H plus the M plus the Super M equals 3 machines. Last year we had 1. Michael said, "What does that mean?" Curtis said, "It means we can take on more contracted acres. More acres means more income. More income means we can buy more equipment. More equipment means more capacity. The cycle feeds itself if we do not interrupt it with debt." Michael said, "Mr. Dietrich has debt." Curtis said, "Mr. Dietrich has monthly payments. We have equipment that is paid for. When the bank raises interest rates, which they will, Dietrich's payments increase. Our costs do not change." Michael said, "How do you know the bank will raise rates?" Curtis said, "I do not know, but I do not have to know because I do not have debt. That is the point. I control what I can control." On March 15th, Curtis received a call from Harold Jensen, a farmer who operated 280 acres 12 miles south of the Brennan place. Harold said, "Curtis, I heard you picked up some additional equipment over the winter." Curtis said, "2 tractors." Harold said, "Are you taking on additional contracts for spring planting?" Curtis said, "I am." Harold said, "I have been contracting with Roy Dietrich for the past 4 years. I am not happy with the results." Curtis said, "What is the problem?" Harold said, "Soil compaction. Bill Kowalski from the Extension Office has been tracking compaction across the county, and he showed me the data from my fields. Your fields are running 180 psi at 6 inches. Dietrich's fields are running 285. My yields last year were down 11 bushels per acre from 67, and Kowalski says compaction is the reason. Curtis said, Dietrich runs heavier equipment. Harold said, that is what Kowalski said. I want lighter equipment on my ground. Can you handle 280 acres? Curtis calculated. His current contracts for spring 1969 totaled 305 acres. Harold's 280 would bring the total to 585. 3 tractors, 10-day weather window, 2 operators counting himself. The math worked if the weather held. Curtis said, I can handle it. Harold said, what is your rate? Curtis quoted the rate, the same rate he had been charging since 1966, $2.60 per acre for planting. Harold said, Dietrich charges $2.80. Curtis said, I am not Dietrich. Harold said, I will take it. Book me for spring planting and fall cultivation. Curtis hung up the phone and walked to the barn where Judith was reviewing the account books. He said, we just picked up 280 acres from Harold Jensen. Judith looked up and said, that is a 46% increase over last year. Curtis said, it is. She said, can we handle it? He said, if the weather holds. She said, and if it does not? Curtis said, then we work through the rain. Judith made a note in the accounts ledger and said, at $260 per acre, that is $728 additional gross for spring planting. If we get the fall cultivation contract, that is another $560. Total additional gross is $1288 for the year from Jensen alone. Curtis said, minus operating costs. Judith said, even after operating costs, that is an $800 increase to the equipment fund. You could buy another tractor next winter. Curtis said, that is the idea. Through late March and into April, Curtis prepared for the spring planting season, servicing all 3 tractors, inventorying parts, organizing the schedule of fields and contracts. He hired Ed Kowalski, the 62-year-old brother of Bill Kowalski, the extension agent, to operate the Farmall H during planting season. Ed had retired from farming in 1965 when he sold his land, but he missed the work and was willing to drive a tractor for hourly wages if the hours were predictable and the equipment was maintained. Curtis said, equipment is maintained. Hours are weather dependent. Ed said, that is farming. Curtis said, $12 per day plus lunch. You work the H, I work the M, and the Super M alternating. Ed said, why alternating? Curtis said, because I do not trust anyone else to operate equipment. I just rebuilt until I have seen it work under load for a full season. Ed said, fair enough. The weather window opened on April 12th. The forecast called for 9 consecutive days of clear weather before a front moved in from the west. 9 days was enough if they worked efficiently. Curtis and Ed began on the 13th, Curtis on the Super M and Ed on the H, working Clayton Morris's 80 acres, while Curtis ran the M on a separate 40-acre tract for a farmer named Williams. They worked 14-hour days, sunrise to after dark, and by the end of day 3 they had completed 210 acres. On day 4, the Super M developed a hydraulic leak. Curtis was in the Jensen field planting corn when he noticed hydraulic oil on the frame rail below the pump. He shut down immediately and examined the leak. The inlet fitting had loosened again, the same fitting he had tightened twice before. Curtis tightened it and resumed work, but 3 hours later the leak returned. He shut down again, and this time he removed the fitting completely and examined the threads. The threads on the pump body were worn, not stripped but worn enough that the fitting would not hold torque. This was a problem Curtis had not anticipated because thread wear was not visible during external inspection, and because the fitting had held pressure during his testing in the barn. Curtis drove the Super M back to the barn and called Frank Morrow. Frank arrived 30 minutes later and looked at the pump threads and said, "You need to tap new threads and use a larger fitting." Curtis said, "How long will that take?" Frank said, 2 hours if I do it, 4 if you do it." Curtis said, "I need it done today. We have 6 days of weather left." Frank said, "I will do it. You keep planting with the other machines." Frank tapped new threads into the pump body and installed a larger fitting and tested the system and pronounced it sealed. Curtis resumed work on the Super M that evening, and the hydraulic system held pressure through the remaining 6 days of the weather window. By April 21st, Curtis and Ed had planted all 585 contracted acres, and the spring planting season was complete. Curtis paid Ed $108 for 9 days of work and updated the equipment capital account ledger with the operating costs, fuel, parts, Ed's wages, total $420. Gross income from spring planting, $1,521. Net income after operating costs, $1,101. Curtis transferred $300 to the equipment fund and allocated the remaining $801 to family living and operating reserve. Judith reviewed the numbers and said, "$300 is less than you projected." Curtis said, "I had an unplanned repair on the Super M thread wear on the hydraulic pump. Cost me $40 in parts and Frank's labor." She said, "That brings your total Super M cost to $115. Curtis said, "Correct." She said, "You are still profitable on the Super M, but the margin is thinner than you calculated." Curtis said, "The margin is always thinner than you calculate when you buy used equipment. That is why you build in margin." Judith closed the ledger and said, "Next winter you can buy a third tractor if you want. Equipment fund will support it." Curtis said, "I know." Through the summer of 1969, Curtis worked the custom farming contracts and maintained the 3 tractors and watched for equipment opportunities. In July, he heard from Frank Morrow that an estate sale was scheduled for August 9th in a town called Erling, 40 miles northwest of Heartland. The estate included 4 International Harvester tractors from the 1940s and 1950s, all of them older models. All of them worked hard by a farmer who had died in June and whose children were liquidating the farm to divide the estate. Frank said, "The tractors are rough, but if you are looking for projects, they might be worth the drive." Curtis said, "Are you going?" Frank said, "I am not buying, but I will ride along if you want a second opinion." On August 9th, Curtis and Frank drove to Erling and walked the equipment lots. The 4 tractors were a 1947 Farmall H, a 1949 Farmall M, a 1951 Farmall M, and a 1953 Super M. Curtis spent 20 minutes with each machine, performing the same assessment routine he had used at the Kemper auction, checking compression, inspecting for cracks, diagnosing visible problems. 3 of the 4 tractors were salvageable, with reasonable repair costs. The 1947 H had a cracked engine block, a terminal problem that would require a complete engine replacement at a cost that exceeded the tractor's value. Curtis marked it off his list. The 2 MS and the Super M were candidates. The 1949 M needed a clutch and a magneto rebuild. The 1951 M needed a transmission seal and front wheel bearings. The 1953 Super M needed a complete hydraulic system overhaul and a steering sector replacement. Curtis estimated repair costs: 1949 M $70, 1951 M $40, 1953 Super M $120. Combined $230. He calculated his bid ceiling for all three machines together, $600 maximum. The auction began at 1 in the afternoon. Curtis waited until the 4 tractors came up as a lot. The auctioneer said, 4 IH tractors, selling as a group, opening at $400. A dealer from Council Bluffs bid $425. Curtis bid $450. The dealer bid $500. Curtis bid $550. The dealer looked at the tractors again and walked away. Curtis won at $550. He paid the clerk and arranged to pick up the 3 salvageable machines the following Saturday. The 1947H with the cracked block he left for scrap. On the drive home, Frank said, "You just bought $300 worth of work." Curtis said, "I bought $900 worth of working tractors for $550 plus parts." Frank said, "If the repairs go as planned." Curtis said, "They will go as planned because I will follow the manual and I will check my work." Frank said, "You have manuals for all 3. Curtis said, "I have manuals for the Ms. I will need to photocopy the Super M manual again. The one I have is for the 53, and these are close enough that the same manual will work." Frank said, "You are going to spend another winter in that cold barn." Curtis said, "I am going to spend another winter building capacity." By September, Curtis had transported all 3 tractors to his barn and had begun the assessment and repair process. Michael, now 15 and stronger than he had been the previous winter, took a larger role in the work. Curtis assigned him the 1951M as a solo project. Michael would assess it, order the parts, perform the repairs, and document the work, all under Curtis's supervision but with Michael making the decisions. Curtis said, "You make a mistake, you learn from it. You do it right, you learn from that too." Michael said, "What if I cannot figure something out?" Curtis said, "You ask, but you try first." Michael worked on the 1951M through September and October, and by November he had completed the repairs and the tractor was operational. The work had taken him longer than it would have taken Curtis, and Michael had made errors that required rework. But the final result was a functional tractor, and Michael had learned more from the process than he would have learned from watching Curtis do the work. Curtis reviewed Michael's repair log and found it complete and accurate, and he said, "You did it right. Next time it will go faster." Curtis himself worked on the 1949M and the 1953 Super M through the fall and into early winter. The 1949M required the clutch replacement and magneto rebuild that he had estimated, and the work went smoothly because Curtis had done both repairs before and had the manuals and the tools. The 1953 Super M was more complex because the hydraulic system was completely non-functional and the steering sector was worn beyond adjustment. Curtis ordered parts from Timmins Implement and worked through November and December, disassembling the hydraulic system, replacing every seal and line, rebuilding the pump with the knowledge he had gained from the first Super M rebuild. The steering sector required a used part from a salvage yard in Des Moines, and Curtis drove 3 hours to inspect the part before buying it, because buying unseen parts from salvage yards was a risk he was not willing to take. By January of 1970, all 3 tractors from the Erling auction were operational. Curtis updated the equipment capital account ledger with the final costs: 1949M $68, 1951M $42, 1953 Super M $138. Combined $248 in parts plus $550 purchase equals $798 total capital. Estimated combined working value, $1,300. Margin, $502. Curtis now had 6 tractors, the original 1947H, the 2 from the Kemper auction, and the 3 from Erling. 6 tractors meant capacity for 1,200 acres or more depending on weather and operator availability. Curtis sat at the kitchen table with Judith and said, "We need to talk about expansion." Judith said, "How much expansion?" Curtis said, "Double what we did last year, 1,200 acres contracted." She said, "Do we have the operators?" He said, "Ed Kowalski can work full-time if we need him. Michael can operate one machine. I can operate two. That is four. We need two more." Judith said, "Hiring two operators changes the cost structure." Curtis said, "It does, but the revenue increase more than covers it." They worked through the numbers together, projecting revenue at 1,200 acres, calculating operating costs with two additional hired operators, estimating the net income. The projection showed a $2,200 increase to the equipment fund for 1970 if the weather cooperated and the equipment performed. Curtis said, "This is the cycle. Income funds equipment. Equipment increases capacity. Capacity increases income." Judith said, "What happens when the cycle breaks?" Curtis said, "We make sure it does not break. We maintain the equipment. We do not overextend on contracts. We do not borrow." She said, "And if equipment fails in the field?" He said, "We fix it. That is why we know how to fix it." Judith closed the ledger and said, "I approve the expansion. But Curtis, we are getting to a scale where one man cannot manage all of this alone. You need to start thinking about what happens if you are not available." Curtis said, "Michael is learning." She said, "Michael is 15. What happens if you are injured or sick during planting season?" Curtis did not answer immediately because the question was one he had not wanted to ask himself. He had built the operation on his own knowledge and his own labor, and the idea of the operation continuing without him was not something he had planned for. But Judith was right. Scale brought risk. Risk required planning. Curtis said, "I will think about it." That night Curtis lay awake thinking about what Judith had said. The operation had grown from one tractor and 240 acres to 6 tractors and projected 1,200 acres in 2 years. The growth had been intentional, the result of the method he had developed, but the growth had also created dependencies. If Curtis was injured during planting season, the contracts would fail. The clients would lose confidence. The operation would collapse. Michael knew how to repair equipment, but Michael did not yet know how to run a planting season, how to sequence fields, how to manage weather risk, how to make the 100 small decisions that kept 1,200 acres moving through a 10-day window. Curtis decided that Michael needed to learn not just the mechanical work but the operational work. The repairs were skills. The operation was knowledge. Skills could be taught through demonstration. Knowledge required experience. Curtis would give Michael that experience by involving him in every operational decision for the 1970 season. Michael would learn by watching and by asking and by being present when Curtis made the calls that determined whether the operation succeeded or failed. The spring of 1970 arrived with the weather window opening on April 18th. Curtis had contracted 1,140 acres, slightly below his projection but within capacity. He hired 2 additional operators, both retired farmers who wanted part-time work, and he assigned machines and fields and began the planting sequence. Michael operated the 1951 M that he had rebuilt, working independently on a 200-acre tract while Curtis rotated between the other machines, checking progress, solving problems, maintaining the schedule. On April 23rd, day 6 of a 9-day weather window, the 1949 Farmall M threw a rod. Curtis was running a field 8 miles from the barn when he heard the knock and saw the oil pressure drop and shut down immediately. A thrown rod was a catastrophic engine failure, the result of a connecting rod breaking and punching through the crankcase, and it was not repairable in the field. Curtis called Ed Kowalski on the CB radio and had Ed bring the truck and trailer. They loaded the broken M and Curtis drove it back to the barn and parked it and returned to the field on the Super M and finished the day's work. That evening, Curtis examined the broken M and confirmed what he had heard. The number 3 rod had broken and the piston had punched through the side of the block. The engine was destroyed. Curtis would need either a replacement engine or a complete rebuild, and either option would cost more than the tractor was worth. He walked to the house and told Judith what had happened. She said, "What do you want to do?" Curtis said, "Part it out. Sell what is salvageable, use the rest for scrap." She said, "What is the loss?" He said, "I have $68 in repairs and 1/3 of $550 purchase cost, which is $183. Total $251. Salvage value may be $80. Net loss $171. Judith said, "That is the first loss we have taken." Curtis said, "It will not be the last. Used equipment fails. That is the cost of buying used." She said, "Does this change your method?" He said, "No. The margin on the other 5 tractors covers this loss twice over. The method works because the wins are bigger than the losses." Curtis sold the broken M for parts and scrap and netted $76, slightly less than his estimate. He updated the equipment capital account ledger with the loss and noted in the margin, "First equipment failure. Rod failure likely due to oil starvation from previous owner neglect. Not preventable through assessment. Acceptable loss within margin." The spring 1970 season concluded successfully despite the M failure, and Curtis's gross income for the season was $2,100 after operating costs. He transferred $700 to the equipment fund and began looking for the next acquisition. The cycle continued because the method was sound, and because Curtis understood that failure was part of the process when you bought equipment that other people had given up on. You accepted the losses because the wins covered them, and because the alternative was debt, and debt was the trap that ended operations when times got hard. Curtis Brennan had been farming for 8 years, and he had never borrowed money for equipment, and he never would, because the man who borrows is the man who loses control, and control was the only thing Curtis had that Roy Dietrich did not. That difference would matter more than either of them knew in the years ahead. The spring of 1971 opened with weather that Iowa farmers would remember for a decade afterward, not because it was unusually wet or unusually dry, but because it was unpredictable in the specific way that makes planting decisions difficult and costly when the decisions are wrong. The long-range forecast in early April called for a stable pattern, 10 days of clear weather starting April 15th, and most farmers in Shelby County scheduled their planting operations around that window. Curtis Brennan scheduled his operation the same way because weather forecasting was not a science that allowed alternatives, and a farmer who waited for perfect certainty would never plant at all. The window opened on schedule. April 15th arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the low 60s and ground conditions that were dry enough for equipment, but not so dry that the seed would lack moisture. Curtis had contracted 1,400 acres for the 1971 season, a 23% increase over 1970, and he had the equipment capacity to handle it if the weather held and if nothing broke. He ran 6 tractors with 4 operators counting himself. Ed Kowalski on the Farmall H, 2 hired men named Pete Arneson and Dale McKinney on 2 of the Farmall M models, and Curtis rotating between the Super M machines depending on which fields needed the heavier equipment. Michael, now 16, operated the 1951 M that he had rebuilt and ran it on the smaller contracted tracks where a younger operator could work independently without risking the larger accounts. Day 1 and Day 2 proceeded without incident. The tractors performed. The operators covered ground at the projected rate. By the end of day 2, Curtis had completed 320 acres and was ahead of schedule by half a day, which meant that if the weather held for the full 10 days, he would finish with time to spare and could take on additional work if any became available. He updated his planning board that evening, a sheet of plywood mounted in the barn with the field assignments and acre counts marked in grease pencil, and he calculated that 6 more days at current pace would complete the primary contracts and leave 2 days for contingency or opportunity. On the morning of day 3, Curtis received a phone call from Clayton Morris. Clayton said, "Curtis, I have a problem." Curtis said, "What kind of problem?" Clayton said, "My planting contractor backed out, said he took a bigger job in Cass County and cannot cover my acres. I have 320 acres that need to be in the ground in the next week or I miss the window." Curtis said, "Who was your contractor?" Clayton said, "Roy Dietrich." Curtis did not respond immediately because the information required processing. Roy Dietrich had been custom farming in Shelby County for 20 years, and his reputation, whatever else could be said about it, included reliability. A contractor who backed out mid-season was a contractor who was either desperate or careless, and Roy Dietrich had not been either of those things when Curtis had last observed him. Curtis said, "Did Roy say why?" Clayton said, "He said the Cass County job was better money. I do not believe him, but it does not matter because I still have 320 acres and no contractor." Curtis said, "When do you need an answer?" Clayton said, "Today. If you cannot do it, I need to find someone else by tonight." Curtis said, "Give me 2 hours." He hung up and walked to the barn and looked at the planning board. 1,400 acres committed plus Clayton's 320 equaled 1,720 total. 6 tractors, 4 operators, 8 days remaining if weather held. The math was tight but possible if nothing broke and if the operators worked longer days. Curtis walked to the house and found Judith at the kitchen table with the account ledger. He said, "Clayton Morris needs 320 acres planted. Roy Dietrich backed out on him." Judith said, "Can we handle it?" Curtis said, "If nothing breaks and weather holds." She said, "That is 2 conditions we cannot control." He said, "I know, but the contract is worth $832 gross. After operating costs, that is $550 to the equipment fund." Judith looked at the projection she had been working on for 1971 income and said, "$550 puts us over $2,000 in the equipment fund for the year. That is enough for 2 more tractors if you find them at the right price." Curtis said, "It is a risk. If weather breaks or equipment fails, we could end up defaulting on Clayton or someone else." Judith said, "What does your gut say?" Curtis said, "My gut says Roy Dietrich does not back out of contracts for better money. Something else is happening." She said, "Does that change the decision?" He said, "No, Clayton needs help. We can provide it. I am taking the contract." Curtis called Clayton and said, "I will do it. Same rate as your previous contract with Roy. I start on your acres day 7 assuming I am on schedule with current contracts." Clayton said, "What if you are not on schedule?" Curtis said, "Then I work nights with lights." Clayton said, "I appreciate it, Curtis." Curtis updated the planning board with Clayton's 320 acres marked for days 7 and 8, and he recalculated the daily targets. The margin for error had disappeared. Every tractor would need to run every scheduled hour. Every operator would need to maintain pace. Curtis called a meeting that evening with Ed and Pete and Dale and Michael, and he explained the situation and the revised schedule. He said, "We have 8 days to cover 1,720 acres. That is 215 per day average. Yesterday we did 160. We need to increase pace by 35%. Pete said, "How?" Curtis said, "Longer days. We start at first light and we run until dark. No extended breaks. Lunch in the field. Dale said, "What if something breaks?" Curtis said, "We fix it fast. I will keep parts inventory in the truck. Michael will run support. If a tractor goes down, Michael brings parts and tools and we repair in place." Ed said, "What if it rains?" Curtis said, "Forecast is clear for 8 more days. We trust the forecast until it is wrong." They began day 4 at 5:40 in the morning with enough light to see the field markers. Curtis had assigned the largest fields to himself and Pete, because they were the fastest operators and speed would matter more as the schedule compressed. Michael ran the parts truck, monitoring the CB radio, delivering fuel and parts to the fields as needed, learning the logistics that kept 4 tractors and 4 operators moving across 1,400 acres without losing time to preventable delays. By day 6, they had completed 1,200 acres and were still on schedule. The weather had held. The equipment had performed. Curtis allowed himself to think that the 10-day window might actually deliver 10 days, and that Clayton's 320 acres would fit into the plan without requiring night work. Then on the morning of day 7, the forecast changed. Curtis heard it on the radio while driving to the first field of the day. The Weather Service had revised the 10-day forecast based on a low-pressure system developing over Nebraska. The system was moving east and would reach western Iowa by day 9. Precipitation likely. Heavy at times. The clear window that had been promised for 10 days was now promised for 7.5. Curtis pulled the truck to the side of the road and sat with the engine idling while he recalculated. 1,200 acres complete. 520 remaining including Clayton's 320. 7.5 days available was now 1.5 days available. 215 acres per day average was now 347 acres per day required. The math did not work with 4 operators and 6 tractors. Curtis would need to add capacity or reduce the contracted acres, and reducing contracted acres meant defaulting on Clayton Morris or defaulting on someone else, and defaulting meant reputation damage that would cost more than the immediate loss of revenue. He picked up the CB radio and called Michael. Michael responded from the parts truck. Curtis said, "Meet me at the Morris field. We have a problem." They met 30 minutes later at the edge of Clayton's 320-acre tract. Curtis explained the forecast change and the math. Michael said, "What are you going to do?" Curtis said, "We are going to plant 347 acres today and 347 tomorrow, and we are going to finish before the rain starts." Michael said, "How?" Curtis said, "You are going to operate a tractor. That gives us 5 in the field instead of 4. Michael said, "What about parts support?" Curtis said, "We pray nothing breaks." Michael said, "And if something does?" Curtis said, "Then I fix it while you keep planting." They returned to the staging area and Curtis reassigned the fields. Michael would take the 1951 M and cover a straight 200-acre section where errors would be visible and correctable. Pete and Dale and Ed would take the more complex fields that required experience. Curtis would rotate between the 2 Super M tractors, taking whichever machine was positioned for the next field in sequence. The plan required precision. Every operator would need to maintain speed. Every field would need to be planted in the correct order to minimize travel time between tracts. Curtis had sequenced the fields on the planning board the night before, and now he transferred that sequence to the operators, drawing maps on notebook paper, assigning start times, designating CB radio check-in intervals. They started at 6 in the morning on day 7. The air temperature was 58 degrees and rising, and the ground was perfect, dry enough to avoid compaction, but moist enough that the seed would germinate quickly once it was in. Curtis worked the first Super M across Clayton Morris's north section. a 160-acre rectangle that bordered a county road, and he pushed the tractor harder than he normally would, running the planter at 6 miles per hour instead of 5, accepting the small increase in fuel consumption, because time was the limiting factor now, and fuel was cheap compared to defaulting on a contract. By noon they had completed 410 acres. Curtis checked in with each operator on the CB radio. Ed reported the H was running smooth. Pete reported the M was using oil but not smoking. Dale reported no issues. Michael reported that the 1951 M had developed a vibration in the steering but was still functional. Curtis told Michael to keep running and he would check the steering that evening. They broke for lunch in the field, 15 minutes, sandwiches that Judith had packed that morning, and then back to work. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Curtis was running the Super M across a field 8 miles from the barn when he saw lightning in the west. The lightning was distant, perhaps 30 miles away, but it was visible in daylight, which meant the storm cell was large and the forecast revision had been optimistic. Curtis stopped the tractor and used the CB to call all operators. He said, "Lightning west. Storm coming early. We have maybe 4 hours. Push hard." The next 4 hours tested every piece of equipment and every operator in ways that normal planting seasons do not test them. Curtis ran the Super M at maximum sustainable speed, watching the engine temperature gauge, listening for the sounds that indicate stress, planting corn in rows that were straight enough to pass inspection, but not perfect because perfect required time and time was gone. Ed and Pete and Dale did the same on their machines, pushing the old Farmall tractors to their limits, and the tractors responded because Curtis had maintained them, and because equipment that is maintained will usually perform when it is needed. Michael pushed the 1951 M past what he thought it could handle and learned that tractors are more durable than they appear, and that vibration in the steering is often a loose bolt rather than a structural failure, and that fear of breaking something is different from actually breaking something. He finished his assigned 200 acres by 5:30 and radioed Curtis for the next assignment. Curtis sent him to a 60-acre tract that Dale had not reached yet, and Michael completed it by 7:15 with the storm clouds overhead and the first raindrops starting to fall. Curtis finished the last field at 7:43. He shut down the Super M and sat in the seat and felt the rain increasing from drops to steady precipitation, and he knew that they had cut the margin as close as it could be cut. He radioed all operators and said, "We are done. Bring the equipment to the barn." They gathered at the barn by 8:30, all 5 operators and all 6 tractors, and Curtis walked the line of machines checking for damage. The Super M that he had been running had a cracked exhaust manifold from heat stress. The H that Ed had been operating had burned through a quart of oil more than normal. The 1951 M that Michael had driven had a loose steering sector bolt that Curtis tightened in 5 minutes with a wrench. None of the damage was severe. All of it was repairable. Curtis said, "Good work. We planted 1720 acres in 7 days. That is a record for this operation." Ed said, "We got lucky with the equipment." Curtis said, "Luck is what happens when you maintain things before they break." They dispersed and Curtis walked to the house and found Judith waiting. She said, "Did you finish?" He said 7:43. Rain started 7:30. She said 13 minutes. He said 13 minutes. She sat down at the table and Curtis sat across from her and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Judith said, "That was too close." Curtis said it was. She said, "What if it had rained an hour earlier?" He said, "We would have failed on Clayton's contract and probably someone else's." She said, "Can we operate like this? Can we keep taking risks like this?" Curtis said, "We did not take a risk. We took a calculated chance based on the available information. The forecast said 10 days. We planned for 10 days. When the forecast changed, we adapted. Judith said, "You adapted by pushing equipment and people past safe limits." Curtis said, "I pushed them past comfortable limits. There is a difference." She said, "Curtis, what happens when you push past comfortable and something actually breaks? What happens when Michael gets hurt because you sent him into a field with a tractor that had a steering problem?" Curtis did not answer immediately because the question had weight, and because Judith was asking it not to argue but because she was right to ask it. The operation had grown from one tractor to six, from 240 acres to 1,700, and the growth had been managed through careful planning and disciplined execution, but growth always carried risk, and the risk always increased as the scale increased. Curtis said, "The steering bolt was loose. It was not a steering problem. Michael was never in danger." Judith said, "This time. What about next time?" Curtis said, "Next time I will inspect the steering before sending him out." She said, "That is not my point. My point is that we are getting to a scale where one person cannot inspect everything and cannot make every decision and cannot be in 5 places at once. You are trying to run a 1,700-acre operation with the same methods you used for a 240-acre operation, and it is not sustainable." Curtis knew she was right, but he also knew that the alternative was hiring more people or reducing contracts, and hiring more people meant payroll, and payroll meant fixed costs, and fixed costs were the beginning of the trap that debt represented. He said, "What do you want me to do?" Judith said, "I want you to think about what happens if you are not available, if you get sick or injured, if you cannot make the decisions for a week. Does this operation continue or does it collapse?" Curtis said, "Michael is learning." Judith said, "Michael is 16. He is learning how to repair tractors and how to plant fields, but he is not learning how to run the operation. He does not know what you know about sequencing and logistics and risk management. If something happens to you, this operation ends and we lose everything we have built." Curtis sat in silence because there was nothing to say that would address what Judith was identifying. She was right. The operation had become dependent on Curtis in a way that was not sustainable at scale. He had built it intentionally that way because centralized decision-making was efficient, and because he trusted his own judgment more than he trusted anyone else's. But efficiency and trust were not the same as resilience, and resilience was what Judith was asking for. He said, "I will teach Michael the operational work, not just the mechanical work, how to plan a season, how to sequence fields, how to manage risk. He needs to know what I know so that if I am not here, the operation continues." Judith said, "When will you start?" Curtis said, "Tomorrow." The rain continued through the night and into the next day, and the ground that had been perfect for planting became too wet to work, and the planting season closed. Curtis used the downtime to repair the equipment damage from the 7-day push, replacing the cracked exhaust manifold on the Super M, changing the oil on all 6 tractors, inspecting every system that had been stressed during the intense schedule. Michael worked alongside him, and Curtis began the teaching that he had promised Judith he would begin. He started with the planning board. Curtis brought Michael to the barn and showed him the plywood sheet with the grease pencil marks that represented the 1,700 acres they had just planted. He said, "This is how you plan a season. Every field is a block. Every block has an acre count and a soil type and a contract rate. You sequence the blocks based on geography and equipment availability and weather forecast. The goal is to minimize travel time and maximize equipment utilization." Michael studied the board and said, "How do you decide which field to plant first?" Curtis said, "You start with the fields that are farthest from the barn because if weather closes the window early, you want the distant fields done and the close fields remaining. Close fields you can reach quickly if a short window reopens. Distant fields you cannot. Michael said, "What if the distant fields have bad soil conditions?" Curtis said, "Then you adjust. Soil conditions override geography. You plant where the ground is ready even if it means more travel time." They went through the planning logic for 2 hours, Curtis explaining the decision framework, Michael asking questions, and by the end of the session, Michael understood the structure even if he did not yet have the experience to execute it independently. Curtis said, "Next season you will plan the board. I will review it, but you will do the initial layout. That is how you learn." Through the summer and fall of 1971, Curtis continued the operational teaching while maintaining the equipment and working the cultivation and harvest contracts that followed the spring planting. Michael learned how to calculate fuel requirements and parts inventory and operator scheduling, and all of the logistics that supported the field work, but that were invisible to anyone who only saw tractors moving across acres. By the time winter arrived, Michael could explain why Curtis made the decisions he made, even if Michael could not yet make those decisions himself with the same confidence. In November, Curtis received a call from Bill Kowalski, the county extension agent who had been tracking soil compaction data across Shelby County farms for the past 3 years. Bill said, "Curtis, I am putting together a presentation for the Winter Farm Bureau meeting, and I wanted to talk to you about your operation." Curtis said, "What about it?" Bill said, "You are running the largest custom farming operation in the county now, and your soil compaction numbers are still significantly lower than competitors who run newer equipment. I want to include your operation as a case study in the presentation." Curtis said, "What kind of case study?" Bill said, "Demonstrating that equipment age is not the primary factor in soil compaction. Weight is the primary factor. Your IH tractors from the 40s and 50s are lighter than the modern equipment that Roy Dietrich and others are running, and the compaction data shows the difference clearly." Curtis said, "I would rather not be named in the presentation." Bill said, "I can keep it anonymous, but the data is public and people in the county know who runs what equipment. It will not be hard to figure out." Curtis said, "Keep it anonymous anyway." Bill said, "Can I ask why you do not want recognition?" Curtis said, "Because recognition invites attention and attention invites competition and competition drives up the price of used equipment at auctions." Bill laughed and said, "That is the most Curtis Brennan answer I have ever heard." Curtis said, "It is the truth." The Farm Bureau meeting was held on December 14th at the County Extension Office, and Curtis attended because attendance at extension meetings was part of being a farmer in Shelby County, and because the information presented at these meetings was occasionally useful. Bill Kowalski gave his presentation on soil compaction and included the anonymous case study of a local custom farming operation that achieved low compaction rates through the use of lighter vintage equipment. The presentation included charts showing compaction levels across different equipment types and yield data, correlating lower compaction with higher crop yields over multi-year periods. Roy Dietrich was in attendance. Curtis saw him sitting 3 rows ahead and to the left, and Curtis watched Roy's posture change as the presentation progressed, and the data made clear that heavier equipment was damaging soil structure and reducing yields. Roy did not speak during the presentation, but after it concluded, he approached Bill Kowalski and Curtis could hear fragments of the conversation from across the room. Roy said, "This data is misleading. Modern equipment has better weight distribution." Bill said, "The data accounts for weight distribution. The total weight is still the determining factor." Roy said, "Who is the operation you are using as the case study?" Bill said, I am not identifying specific operators. Roy said, "It is Brennan. Everyone knows it is Brennan." Bill said, "The data speaks for itself regardless of whose operation it represents." Roy walked away and Curtis saw him leave the building and get into his truck and drive off. Curtis approached Bill and said, "That went well." Bill said, "Roy is not happy. He has been losing contracts to you for 2 years and now he knows why." Curtis said, "He knows why because he has been paying attention. The data just confirmed what he should have already figured out." Bill said, "Some people do not figure things out until the data forces them to see it." Curtis drove home and told Judith about the meeting and Roy's reaction. Judith said, "Is Roy going to be a problem?" Curtis said, "Roy has been losing contracts because his equipment compacts soil and reduces yields. That is not my problem. That is his problem." She said, "People do not always see their problems as their problems. Sometimes they see their problems as someone else's fault." Curtis said, "Roy can see it however he wants. I am not going to change what I am doing because Roy is unhappy about the results he is getting." 3 days later, Curtis received a call from Harold Jensen, one of his long-term clients. Harold said, "Curtis, I need to talk to you about something." Curtis said, "What is it?" Harold said, "Roy Dietrich came by my place yesterday. He said you are running junk equipment that is going to fail mid-season and leave me without a planting contractor. He offered to take over my contract at a lower rate than you are charging." Curtis said, "What did you tell him?" Harold said, "I told him I have been working with you for 3 years and you have never missed a contract, and my yields have gone up every year since I switched from Roy's service to yours." Curtis said, "I appreciate that." Harold said, "I wanted you to know what Roy is doing. He is going to other farmers and trying to undercut your contracts." Curtis said, "That is his right. Farmers can contract with whoever they want." Harold said, "I am not switching, but I thought you should know." Curtis hung up and sat for a moment thinking about Roy Dietrich and what Harold had said. A contractor who was losing business and who responded by trying to undercut competitors on price was a contractor who was feeling pressure, and pressure made people do things they would not normally do. Curtis did not know what kind of pressure Roy was under, but he knew that price competition was a race to the bottom, and that the contractor who competed on price alone would eventually fail because there was always someone willing to go lower, and lower meant no margin, and no margin meant no resilience when things went wrong. Curtis did not change his rates. He did not call Roy. He continued operating the same way he had been operating, and through the winter he added 2 more tractors to the fleet, a 1956 Farmall 400 and a 1958 Farmall 560, both purchased at estate auctions, both requiring repairs that Curtis and Michael completed over the course of January and February. By spring 1972, Curtis had 8 tractors and contracts for 1,900 acres, and the operation continued to grow, while Roy Dietrich's operation continued to contract. In March, Curtis saw Roy at the implement dealer in Heartland. Curtis was picking up parts and Roy was at the counter talking to Martin Timmons about financing options for a new tractor. Curtis heard Roy say, "I need to upgrade to lighter equipment. The compaction data is killing me. What can you finance?" Martin said, "We can finance anything you want, but your current equipment loan balance is $21,000. You want to add to that." Roy said, "I do not have a choice. I am losing contracts." Martin said, "Roy, I am not your banker, but I am your parts guy, and I see your repair bills, and I know what it costs to run new iron. You are already stretched thin. Adding more debt is not going to fix your problem." Roy said, "What do you suggest?" Martin said, I suggest you figure out why Brennan is beating you with tractors that are 20 years older than yours." Curtis left before Roy saw him. He drove home and told Judith what he had overheard. Judith said, "Roy is going to finance newer equipment to compete with you." Curtis said, "That is what it sounded like." She said, "That seems like the wrong solution to his problem." Curtis said, "It is the wrong solution. His problem is not his equipment age. His problem is his equipment weight and his cost structure. Financing lighter new equipment will solve the weight problem, but it will make the cost structure worse." Judith said, "How much debt do you think Roy has?" Curtis said, "I do not know, but if he has 21,000 in equipment loans and he is financing more, then he is carrying at least 30,000 in total debt, maybe more." She said, "What is his revenue?" Curtis said, "I do not know his revenue either, but if he is losing contracts the way Harold said, then his revenue is falling while his debt service is staying constant or increasing if he adds new loans." Judith opened the equipment capital account ledger and showed Curtis their numbers. 0 debt. 8 tractors valued at approximately $6,400 combined. Equipment fund balance $1,200. Contracts for 1,900 acres projected to gross $4,900 for the 1972 season. She said, "We have no debt and he has 30,000. We are growing and he is shrinking. How does this end?" Curtis said, "It ends with Roy either figuring out how to fix his cost structure or going out of business." She said, "And if he goes out of business?" Curtis said, "Then there will be more contracts available and more used equipment at bankruptcy auctions." Judith closed the ledger and said, "That sounds cold." Curtis said, "It is not cold. It is reality. I did not create Roy's problems. Roy created Roy's problems by financing equipment he could not afford and by not paying attention to soil compaction data until it was too late. I am not responsible for his decisions." She said, "I know, but you are going to benefit from his failure." Curtis said, "I am going to benefit from doing things right. If Roy had done things right, he would be benefiting too. The market does not care about fairness. The market cares about results." The spring 1972 season opened with clear weather and Curtis completed the 1,900 contracted acres in 9 days with no equipment failures and no weather delays. The operation ran smoothly because Curtis had planned it carefully, and because Michael had learned enough of the operational work that he could manage field assignments and operator logistics when Curtis was occupied with repairs or client meetings. Michael was 17 now and capable of independent decision-making on routine matters, and Curtis had begun delegating more of the daily management to him, while retaining oversight of the strategic decisions. In June, Curtis received a call from Clayton Morris. Clayton said, "Curtis, Roy Dietrich just told me he is shutting down his custom farming operation. He said he cannot compete anymore." Curtis said, "When is he shutting down?" Clayton said, "End of the season. He is finishing his current contracts and then he is done." Curtis said, "Did he say what he is going to do?" Clayton said, "He said he is going to work at the implement dealer in Council Bluffs, selling equipment instead of running it." Curtis thanked Clayton for the information and hung up. He sat for a moment processing what it meant. Roy Dietrich had been custom farming in Shelby County for 23 years and had been the dominant contractor for most of that time, and now he was shutting down because he could not make the economics work. Curtis felt no satisfaction about this and no vindication. He felt only a kind of distant curiosity about what decisions Roy had made that had led to this outcome, and whether those decisions had been avoidable or whether they had been the inevitable result of a philosophy that believed debt was a tool, and that newer equipment was always better than older equipment. Curtis walked to the house and told Judith. She said, "What does this mean for us?" He said, "It means Roy's clients will need a new contractor. Some of them will call us." She said, "Can we handle more acres?" He said, "We can if we add capacity. 2 more tractors and 1 more operator would let us handle 2,500 acres." Judith said, "Do we want to grow that much?" Curtis said, "We want to grow as much as we can manage without taking on debt. Growth funded from income is sustainable. Growth funded from debt is not. Roy just proved that." Through the remainder of 1972 and into 1973, Curtis absorbed contracts that Roy Dietrich had previously held, and the operation grew to 2,300 acres and 10 tractors, and the equipment capital account ledger showed numbers that Curtis would not have believed possible in 1968 when he bought 2 broken Farmall tractors for $380 at the back fence of an auction lot. The method had worked. The cycle had sustained itself. Income had funded equipment, and equipment had increased capacity, and capacity had increased income, and none of it had required borrowing, and none of it had required anything other than the willingness to buy what other people dismissed, and to fix what other people said was broken. Michael turned 18 in the fall of 1972 and enrolled at Iowa State for the spring 1973 semester, studying agricultural engineering, as Curtis and Judith had encouraged. The college was 3 hours from Shelby County, and Michael returned home on weekends to work in the operation and to maintain the skills he had learned. He met a girl there during his sophomore year, a quiet, pragmatic student named Rebecca Walsh, who was studying agricultural economics and who understood farm finances the way Michael understood equipment mechanics. Michael brought her home to meet Curtis and Judith during spring break of 1974, and Judith saw immediately that Rebecca had the same practical sensibility about money and risk that Judith herself carried. Curtis watched how Rebecca asked questions about the operation. Not polite questions, but genuine technical questions about cost structures and capacity planning. And he understood that if Michael married her, the operation would have the financial partnership in the next generation that Curtis had found with Judith. Curtis Brennan had been right in October 1968 when he stood at that back fence and looked at 2 tractors that everyone else had walked past. The difference between broken and worthless was knowledge. The difference between success and failure was the willingness to apply that knowledge when everyone else was walking away. Roy Dietrich had walked away from that principle, and it had cost him everything he had built. Curtis had walked toward it, and it had given him everything he had. That was the whole story, and it had been visible from the beginning to anyone who was willing to spend 20 minutes looking. The years between 1973 and 1979 passed in a pattern that became familiar to Curtis Brennan, a rhythm of seasons and equipment acquisitions and contracts that grew incrementally each year in a way that felt less like sudden expansion and more like the natural accumulation that happens when a method works and continues working. The custom farming operation that had started with 1 tractor and 240 acres in 1962 had become by 1979 the largest such operation in Shelby County, with 14 tractors and contracted acres that approached 3,000 in good years and never dropped below 2,400 even in difficult seasons. Curtis was 45 years old in the summer of 1979, and he had been farming for 23 years, and he looked like a man who had spent those years doing physical work in weather that did not accommodate human preference. His hands showed the scars of 23 years of wrench work, and his back showed the wear of 23 years of operating equipment that had no suspension beyond the metal springs under the seat. He moved more carefully than he had moved at 30, and he felt the cold more acutely in winter, and he knew without being told that the accumulated stress of 2 decades of farming was beginning to extract its cost from his body in ways that would only increase with time. Michael was 24 in 1979 and had been working in the operation full-time since graduating from Iowa State in 1977 with a degree in agricultural engineering. He had returned to Shelby County, not because he lacked other opportunities, but because he understood that the operation his father had built was something worth continuing, and because he had absorbed through proximity and instruction the philosophy that made the operation different from the operations that borrowed and expanded and failed when economic conditions shifted. Michael ran his own equipment now, a fleet of 4 tractors that he had purchased and repaired using the same methods Curtis had taught him, and he contracted his own acres separate from Curtis's contracts, and the 2 operations functioned independently but supported each other when schedules allowed or when equipment broke and a spare tractor was needed. Michael had married Rebecca Walsh in the summer of 1978, 1 year after graduating, and they had settled into a farmhouse 2 miles from Curtis and Judith. Rebecca managed the books for Michael's operation the same way Judith managed Curtis's, and the 2 women met weekly to review finances and coordinate logistics when the 2 operations needed to share resources. Curtis had been right about Rebecca when he first met her in 1974. She brought the same pragmatic financial discipline to Michael's operation that Judith had brought to his, and Curtis knew that the methodology would continue into the next generation, not just because Michael understood the mechanical work, but because Rebecca understood the financial work. The economic environment that had been relatively stable through most of the 1970s began to shift in 1979 in ways that would prove consequential for anyone who carried debt. The Federal Reserve, responding to inflation that had been building since the oil crisis of 1973, began raising interest rates aggressively in the fall of 1979, and the prime rate climbed from 8% in January to 13% by December, and the climbing did not stop. Farmers who had borrowed to buy land or equipment at rates that seemed manageable in 1976 found themselves in 1979 making payments on loans that had variable rates tied to prime, and the payments increased every time the Fed raised rates, and the revenue from farming did not increase proportionally because commodity prices were being pressured by global competition and by grain embargoes that reduced export demand. Curtis watched this economic shift develop through the reports he read in the farm papers and through the conversations he heard at the implement dealer and at the grain elevator, and he understood that what was happening was the beginning of a stress test that would separate the operations that were resilient from the operations that had been built on assumptions about stable interest rates and rising land values. He had no debt and therefore no direct exposure to interest rate increases, but he knew that the farmers who contracted with him for custom work were exposed, and that if those farmers began to fail then, the contracted acres would disappear, and his revenue would fall even though his costs would remain constant. In November of 1979, Curtis attended the County Farm Bureau meeting, where the topic was managing through the high interest rate environment. Bill Kowalski presented data on average farm debt levels in Shelby County, and the numbers were stark. The average farm operation carried $32,000 in equipment debt, and the average debt service at current interest rates was $620 per month, and the average gross farm income was $38,000 per year, which meant that debt service consumed 19% of gross income before any other expenses were paid. Bill said, "Gentlemen, 19% is manageable in a stable rate environment. But if rates continue climbing and commodity prices stay flat or decline, You are looking at a situation where debt service could reach 25 or 30% of gross, and at that level you are in a cash flow crisis. Those of you who carry equipment debt need to be thinking about contingency plans. Curtis sat in the back row and listened, and did not speak because he had no equipment debt, and therefore had nothing to contribute to a discussion about managing equipment debt. But he watched the faces of the men in the room, and he saw the tension in their expressions, and he knew that some of them were already feeling the pressure, and that others were beginning to understand that the pressure was coming whether they were ready for it or not. After the meeting, Curtis stood in the parking lot and talked with Frank Morrow, who had retired from farming entirely in 1976, but who still attended the Farm Bureau meetings because he liked to stay informed. Frank said, "Curtis, you are the only man in that room who is not worried about interest rates." Curtis said, "I am worried about them, just not for the same reason everyone else is." Frank said, "What are you worried about?" Curtis said, "I am worried that the men who are carrying debt are going to start failing, and when they fail they are going to stop farming, and when they stop farming there will be fewer contracts available for custom work." Frank said, "You think it will get that bad?" Curtis said, "I think it will get bad enough that some operations will not survive. How many I do not know, but some." Frank looked at the men standing in small groups near their trucks, and he said, "Half the men here are leveraged at levels that would have been considered reckless 10 years ago. They borrowed when land was appreciating, and rates were low, and now they are trapped because land values are flat or falling, and rates are high, and they cannot sell their way out because selling would mean taking losses." Curtis said, "That is not my problem." Frank said, "It will be your problem if there are no farmers left to contract with you." Curtis said, "There will always be farmers. The question is which farmers survive and which do not." Curtis drove home and told Judith about the meeting and the debt data. Judith said, "Are we exposed?" Curtis said, "No, we have no debt. Our only exposure is lost revenue if farmers stop contracting with us." She said, "How likely is that?" He said, "I do not know, but I think we should assume that 1980 and 1981 will be harder years than the past few have been." Judith opened the equipment capital account ledger and reviewed the numbers. The equipment fund held $1,800 in cash. The fleet of 14 tractors had a combined working value of approximately $11,000. Contracted acres for 1980 were projected at 2,700. She said, "If we lose 20% of contracts, that is 540 acres and approximately $1,400 in gross revenue. Can we operate on that?" Curtis said, "We can operate on anything that does not require borrowing. The question is whether we continue growing or whether we hold steady." She said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to hold steady through 1980 and see what the economic environment looks like. If the farm crisis develops the way I think it will, there will be equipment available at bankruptcy auctions at prices below what we have been paying at estate sales. We wait and we watch and we buy when the opportunities appear." Through the winter of 1979 and into the spring of 1980, the economic pressure on Iowa farmers increased. Interest rates continued to climb and reached 15% by March, and commodity prices declined as export demand fell, and the combination of high debt service and low revenue began to produce the failures that Curtis had anticipated. In April, a farmer named Robert Kern, who operated 600 acres northwest of Heartland, filed for bankruptcy, and his equipment was liquidated at auction in May. Curtis attended the auction and bought two International Harvester tractors, a 1966 Farmall 706 and a 1968 Farmall 856, for a combined price of $940. Both tractors needed repairs, but the repairs were within Curtis's capability, and the purchase price was less than half what similar tractors would have brought at estate sales in normal market conditions. Curtis brought the tractors home, and he and Michael spent June repairing them, and by July, both were operational and added to the fleet. Michael said, "How many more bankruptcy auctions do you think there will be?" Curtis said, "I do not know, but I think we are at the beginning of this cycle, not the end." Michael said, "Is that good for us or bad for us?" Curtis said, "It is neither. It is what it is. We did not create the conditions that are causing farmers to fail. We are simply positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that failure creates." Michael said, "That sounds cold." Curtis said, "It is not cold. It is business. The farmers who are failing made decisions that put them in positions where they could not survive economic stress. We made different decisions. The difference in outcomes is the result of the difference in decisions." In August, Curtis received a call from a farmer named Donald Richer, who operated 420 acres south of Heartland. Donald said, "Curtis, I need to talk to you about my fall cultivation contract." Curtis said, "What about it?" Donald said, "I am not going to be able to pay you. The bank called my operating loan, and I do not have cash to cover contract work expenses." Curtis said, "Are you filing bankruptcy?" Donald said, "Not yet, but probably by the end of the year." Curtis said, "What do you want to do about the cultivation?" Donald said, "Can you do it on credit? I can pay you when I sell the crop in November." Curtis said, "I do not extend credit. Payment is due when the work is completed." Donald said, "Curtis, I have been contracting with you for 6 years. I have never missed a payment." Curtis said, "I know, and I am sorry about your situation, but extending credit is lending money, and I do not lend money. If you can pay when the work is done, I will do the work. If you cannot pay, I will not do the work." Donald said, "So you are just going to walk away?" Curtis said, "I am not walking away. I am declining to provide services that I will not be paid for. That is not the same thing." Donald hung up without saying goodbye, and Curtis sat with the phone in his hand and felt nothing about the conversation, because feeling something would not change the reality that extending credit to farmers who were facing bankruptcy was how contractors went bankrupt themselves. Curtis had built the operation on the principle that debt was a trap and lending money was a form of debt, and he was not going to compromise that principle because a client was in financial distress. Judith had heard the conversation, and she said, "That was harsh." Curtis said, "That was necessary." She said, "Donald has been a good client for 6 years." Curtis said, "And in 6 years he made decisions that put him in a position where he cannot pay for services he needs. I am not responsible for his decisions, and I am not going to absorb the cost of his decisions by working for free." Judith said, "What if everyone takes that position? What if no one will work with farmers who are struggling?" Curtis said, "Then those farmers will fail faster. That is not cruelty. That is economics. The market does not care about loyalty or history. The market cares about whether you can pay for what you receive." In September, Donald Richer filed for bankruptcy, and his land and equipment were liquidated. Curtis did not attend the auction because he did not need additional equipment, and because attending would have felt like attending a funeral for someone he had declined to help. He heard later that the land sold for 40% less than Donald had paid for it in 1976, and that the equipment brought scrap prices because it had been poorly maintained, and because the bankruptcy auction market was becoming saturated with equipment from failed operations. The pattern repeated through the fall of 1980 and into 1981. Farmers who had borrowed heavily against appreciated land values in the mid-1970s found themselves underwater when land values fell and interest rates rose, and the only options available were restructuring debt with banks that were increasingly unwilling to restructure, or liquidating assets at depressed prices to pay down loans that exceeded the value of the collateral. Curtis watched this pattern develop across Shelby County, and he saw operations that had been stable for generations disappear within months because the debt load was unsustainable and the revenue was insufficient and the banks were calling loans. By the end of 1981, Shelby County had seen 14 farm bankruptcies, and the number was projected to increase in 1982. Curtis's contracted acres for 1981 had declined to 2,200 from the 2,700 he had projected before the crisis began, and his gross revenue had declined proportionally. But his costs had not increased because he carried no debt, and debt service was the cost that was destroying the operations around him. He finished 1981 with a net income that was 30% lower than 1979, but still positive and still sufficient to maintain the equipment and to add to the equipment fund. In December of 1980, one Bill Kowalski published a report titled Shelby County Farm Crisis: Survival Factors Analysis. The report analyzed the 14 farm bankruptcies that had occurred in 1980 and 1981 and identified common factors among the failed operations. The primary factor was equipment debt exceeding $25,000 combined with land debt that had been secured against appreciated land values that had subsequently declined. The report noted that operations with zero equipment debt had a survival rate of 100% during the crisis period, and that operations with equipment debt above $25,000 had a failure rate of 38%. The report included an anonymous case study of a custom farming operation that had grown from 240 contracted acres in 1962 to 2,200 acres in 1981, while maintaining zero equipment debt through a strategy of purchasing used equipment at auction prices and performing all repairs internally. The case study noted that this operation had shown revenue decline during the crisis, but had remained profitable and solvent because fixed costs were minimal and debt service was zero. Curtis read the report and recognized his own operation in the anonymous case study, and he knew that anyone in Shelby County who paid attention would recognize it as well. He showed the report to Judith and said, "Kowalski made us the example again." Judith read the case study section and said, "He is documenting what works. That is his job." Curtis said, "I know, but it feels like being put on display." She said, "You built something that survived when others failed. That is worth documenting." Curtis said, "The ones who failed are the ones who borrowed money they could not afford to pay back when conditions changed. I did not do anything special. I just did not do what they did." Judith said, "Not doing what everyone else does when everyone else is wrong is exactly what makes something special." In January of 1982, Curtis attended the Winter Farm Bureau meeting where Bill Kowalski presented the findings from his Survival Factors report. The attendance was smaller than previous years because some of the farmers who had attended in prior years were no longer farming. Bill presented the data and the case study, and when he finished, a man named Warren Hicks, who farmed 800 acres east of Heartland, raised his hand and said, "Bill, everyone in this room knows the case study is Curtis Brennan. Why not just say so?" Bill said, "Because I keep case studies anonymous as a policy." Warren said, "Policy is fine, but we all know it is Curtis, and I think it would be useful to hear from him directly about how he built an operation that survived when others did not." Bill looked at Curtis, who was sitting in the back row. Bill said, "Curtis, do you want to comment?" Curtis did not want to comment, but he understood that declining would seem evasive and evasiveness would invite more questions. He stood and said, "There is nothing complicated about what I did. I bought equipment I could pay for in cash. I repaired it myself. I did not borrow money. That is the whole method." Warren said, "But how did you grow without borrowing? Growth requires capital." Curtis said, "Growth requires capital, but capital does not have to come from borrowing. Capital can come from income. I took a percentage of every dollar I earned and put it into an equipment fund, and I used that fund to buy more equipment. The equipment increased my capacity, and capacity increased my income, and income funded more equipment. The cycle is self-sustaining if you do not interrupt it with debt." Warren said, "How long did it take to build the operation to current scale?" Curtis said, 19 years. I started with one tractor in 1962. I have 14 now." Warren said, 19 years is a long time." Curtis said, "It is longer than borrowing and buying everything at once. But it is sustainable, and it does not put you in a position where you can lose everything if interest rates change or commodity prices fall." Another farmer in the room said, "What about the farmers who did not have 19 years? What about the farmers who needed to grow faster to stay competitive?" Curtis said, "They made a choice. They chose speed over sustainability. Some of them succeeded. Some of them are bankrupt. That is the risk they accepted when they made the choice." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Bill said, "Curtis, what would you say to a young farmer who is starting out today and trying to decide whether to finance equipment or save and buy cash?" Curtis said, "I would say save and buy cash. I would say do not borrow money for depreciating assets. I would say be patient and let the method work. And I would say that the market will test you, and the test will reveal whether you made good decisions or bad decisions, and there is no appeal from that judgment." Curtis sat down, and the meeting continued, but he did not hear much of what was said after that because he was thinking about the question that had been asked, and the answer he had given, and whether the answer was one that anyone would actually follow. The problem with advice that required patience was that patience was the thing that people had the least of when they were starting out, and the promise of immediate results through borrowing was seductive in a way that the promise of eventual results through saving was not. Curtis left the meeting and drove home and told Judith what had been said. Judith said, "Do you think anyone will listen?" Curtis said, "Some will. Most will not. Most people do not change their behavior until the consequences force them to change, and by then it is usually too late." She said, "That is cynical." He said, "That is observational." In March of 1982, Curtis received a call from a number he did not recognize. He answered, and the voice on the other end said, "Curtis, this is Roy Dietrich." Curtis had not spoken to Roy since Roy had shut down his custom farming operation in 1972, and he had not expected to hear from him again. He said, "Roy, it has been a while." Roy said, "It has. I am calling because I need to ask you something." Curtis said, "All right." Roy said, "I am working at the implement dealer in Council Bluffs, selling tractors. The pay is steady, but it is not farming, and I miss the work. I heard you are still running the largest custom operation in the county." Curtis said, "I am." Roy said, "Are you hiring?" The question surprised Curtis because Roy Dietrich had been the dominant custom farmer in Shelby County for 2 decades, and the idea of Roy working for someone else seemed unlikely. Curtis said, "What kind of work are you looking for?" Roy said, "Tractor operator, spring planting, fall harvest, whatever you need." Curtis said, "Why?" Roy said, "Because I need the work and because I know how to do it." Curtis said, Roy, you ran your own operation for 23 years. Why would you want to work for someone else? Roy said, because I do not have an operation anymore. I shut it down because I could not make the economics work. You made the economics work. I would rather work for someone who knows what they are doing than sit in a dealership selling equipment to people who are making the same mistakes I made. Curtis said, what happened to your operation? I know you shut down, but I never heard the details. Roy said, I borrowed too much. I financed equipment to compete with you on soil compaction, and the debt service killed me when interest rates went up. I lost everything except the house and the truck. I do not want to talk about it beyond that. Curtis said, I am not hiring right now. Contracted acres are down because of the farm crisis, and I do not need additional operators. Roy said, if that changes, will you call me? Curtis said, I will consider it. Roy said, thank you. Curtis hung up and sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Roy Dietrich asking for a job and what that conversation represented. Roy had been the man that Curtis had measured himself against in the early years, the successful contractor with the new equipment and the large operation. And now Roy was asking Curtis for work because Roy's method had failed and Curtis's method had not. There was no satisfaction in this for Curtis, because satisfaction required believing that success was about being better than someone else, and Curtis had never believed that. Success was about making decisions that produced sustainable results, and failure was about making decisions that did not, and the difference between the two was visible in the aftermath, when the economic stress test separated the resilient from the fragile. Curtis told Judith about the call that evening. Judith said, are you going to hire him? Curtis said, I do not need another operator. She said, that is not what I asked. I asked if you are going to hire him. Curtis said, why would I hire someone I do not need? Judith said, because he asked for help and because you are in a position to provide it. Curtis said, I am in a position to provide it because I made different decisions than he made. He made decisions that destroyed his operation. Why is that my responsibility to fix? Judith said, it is not your responsibility, but you can help him anyway. Curtis said, helping him means paying him wages that I do not need to pay for work that I do not need done. That is charity, not business. Judith said, and charity is something you are capable of even if you do not practice it often. Curtis did not respond because he knew Judith was right, and because he knew that he was resisting the idea of hiring Roy for reasons that had nothing to do with business logic, and everything to do with a kind of pride that he did not like acknowledging. He had built something that worked by doing the opposite of what Roy had done, and hiring Roy felt like admitting that the difference between them was not as large as Curtis wanted it to be. He said, I will think about it. 2 weeks later, Curtis called Roy and said, I have spring planting work if you are interested. $12 per hour, 6 weeks guaranteed, possibility of extension if the season runs long. Roy said, I am interested. Curtis said, you start April 10th. Be at my barn at 6 in the morning. Roy said, I will be there. And Curtis, thank you. Curtis said, do not thank me, just show up and do the work. Roy showed up on April 10th, and Curtis assigned him to one of the Farmall M tractors and sent him to a field 12 miles from the barn with instructions to plant corn in rows spaced 30 inches apart and to radio in every 2 hours with progress updates. Roy worked the full day, and when he returned to the barn that evening, Curtis inspected the field and found the work acceptable. No gaps, no overlaps, rows straight enough to pass client inspection. Curtis said, you did good work today. Roy said, I used to do this for a living. Curtis said, I know. They worked through the spring planting season together, Roy operating equipment and Curtis managing logistics, and the relationship was professional and functional, and neither of them discussed the history that lay between them. Roy did not ask why Curtis had succeeded where he had failed, and Curtis did not offer explanations, because the explanations were visible in the equipment that Roy was operating. Old International Harvester tractors that Curtis had bought for hundreds of dollars and repaired himself, while Roy had been financing new John Deere equipment for thousands of dollars and making monthly payments that eventually consumed his operation. At the end of the planting season, Curtis paid Roy for 6 weeks of work and said, "I have fall cultivation contracts if you want to come back." Roy said, "I want to come back, but I need to ask you something first." Curtis said, "What?" Roy said, "Why did you hire me? You did not need another operator. Your son could have covered the work I did." Curtis said, "I hired you because you asked, and because you can do the work, and because my wife thought I should." Roy said, "Your wife?" Curtis said, "She said I was capable of charity even if I do not practice it often." Roy said, "This is charity." Curtis said, "This is me paying you wages to do work that I could have done myself or assigned to Michael. So yes, it is charity even if I am calling it employment." Roy looked at Curtis for a moment and then said, "I was wrong about you in '68. When you bought those 2 Farmall tractors at the Kemper auction, I thought you were a fool. I told people you were throwing money away. I was wrong and you were right, and the difference between your operation and my operation is the proof." Curtis said, "The difference is that I did not borrow money and you did. That is the only difference that mattered." Roy said, "It is not the only difference. You knew what you were looking at when you assessed those tractors. I looked at the same tractors and saw junk. You saw opportunity. That is not about debt. That is about knowledge." Curtis said, "Knowledge is worthless if you do not have the discipline to apply it without borrowing. I had both. You had knowledge but you borrowed anyway. That is what killed you." Roy said, "You are right, and I am not asking you to absolve me of responsibility for my decisions. I am just saying thank you for giving me work when you did not have to." Curtis said, "You are welcome. I will call you in September about fall work." Roy worked for Curtis through the fall cultivation season and returned the following spring for planting, and the arrangement continued through 1983 and into 1984. Roy never asked for permanent employment, and Curtis never offered it because permanent employment meant payroll obligations that Curtis was not willing to commit to when contracted acres were variable year to year. But the seasonal arrangement worked for both of them, and Roy proved to be reliable and competent, and Curtis found that hiring him had been the right decision, even if the decision had been made partially for reasons that had nothing to do with business. In the summer of 1984, the farm crisis that had been building since 1979 reached its peak in Shelby County. The number of farm foreclosures for 1984 was projected to reach 22, the highest single-year total in county history, and the cascading effects of those foreclosures were visible in every sector of the agricultural economy. Implement dealers closed. Grain elevators reduced hours. Banks tightened lending standards to levels that made operating loans nearly impossible to obtain for any farmer who was not already established and proven. Curtis's contracted acres for 1984 held steady at 2,300 because the farmers who contracted with him were the ones who had survived the crisis by avoiding the debt that had destroyed their neighbors. These farmers needed custom work more than ever because they were managing more acres themselves after buying land from failed operations at bankruptcy prices, and they needed contractors who were reliable and solvent. Curtis was both. In August, Curtis attended a farm equipment auction in Cass County, where a large operation was being liquidated after the owner filed bankruptcy. The equipment included two International Harvester tractors that interested Curtis, a 1974 IH-1066 and a 1976 IH-1486. Both were newer than most of the equipment in Curtis's fleet, and both were in reasonable condition despite being sold at bankruptcy. Curtis assessed both tractors using his standard 20-minute evaluation and determined that the 1066 needed minor repairs and the 1486 needed a hydraulic pump rebuild. The bidding was light because the bankruptcy auction market was saturated and because most buyers had limited cash. Curtis won the 1066 for $680 and the 1486 for $720. Combined purchase price $1,400. Estimated repair costs $140 for the 1066, $180 for the 1486. Total capital investment $1,720. Estimated working value of both tractors after repair $3,200. Margin $1,480. Curtis brought the tractors home, and he and Michael completed the repairs over the course of September, and by October both were operational and added to the fleet. The equipment capital account ledger showed 16 tractors now, combined working value approximately $14,000, equipment fund balance $2,100, total debt zero. Curtis updated the ledger and closed it and sat in the barn looking at the line of tractors parked in the work bay. 16 tractors, 22 years since he had bought the first two at the Kemper auction. The method had worked exactly as he had believed it would work when he started. Income had funded equipment. Equipment had increased capacity. Capacity had increased income. The cycle had sustained itself through 2 decades, and through an economic crisis that had destroyed operations that were larger and more established than his had ever been. The difference had been debt. The operations that failed had borrowed. The operations that survived had not. It was that simple and that brutal, and there was no appeal from the judgment that the market had rendered. Curtis Brennan had been right in 1968, and he was still right in 1984, and the 16 tractors in his barn were the proof. The farm crisis that had begun in 1979 and peaked in 1984 did not end cleanly. Economic crises never do. They taper and linger and leave behind changed landscapes where the survivors occupy spaces that the failures vacated, and where the lessons learned become the foundation for what comes next. By 1986, the worst of the crisis had passed in Shelby County, but the effects remained visible in the abandoned farmsteads and the reduced number of operations, and in the caution that characterized every financial decision that farmers made in the aftermath. Curtis Brennan was 52 years old in the spring of 1986, and he had been farming for 30 years, and the accumulated wear of those years was evident in ways that could not be hidden. His back hurt constantly now, a chronic pain that radiated from the compression fracture he had sustained in 1983 when he lifted a transmission without help and felt something give in his lower spine. He had ignored the pain for a week, and then Judith had forced him to see Dr. Morrison, who ordered X-rays and told Curtis what Curtis already knew, that L4 and L5 were compressed, and that the damage was permanent, and that continuing to do heavy lifting would make it worse. Curtis had not stopped doing heavy lifting because heavy lifting was part of farming, and ignoring the doctor's advice was easier than reorganizing his work around the advice. But by 1986, the pain had progressed to the point where it affected his sleep and his movement, and his ability to operate equipment for full days without breaks. He felt himself slowing down, and he did not like it, and he did not talk about it, because talking about it would mean acknowledging that the body that had allowed him to build an operation over 3 decades was becoming the limitation that would determine how much longer he could continue. Michael was 31 in 1986 and had been running his own custom farming operation for 9 years. Michael's operation ran parallel to Curtis's, separate contracts and separate equipment, but overlapping logistics when efficiency required sharing resources. Michael had learned the method from Curtis and applied it with the same discipline, and the result was an operation that was profitable and growing and entirely debt-free. Michael had married in 1983, and his wife Rebecca had given birth to their first child, a son named David, in 1985, and Curtis was a grandfather now, though he had not adjusted to thinking of himself that way. On May 14th of 1986, Curtis was in the barn moving a hydraulic cylinder from the workbench to the Super M when the pain in his back flared with an intensity that was different from the usual chronic ache. He felt something shift, and then the pain became sharp and specific, and his legs stopped responding to the commands his brain was sending. He collapsed with the cylinder still in his hands, and he lay on the concrete floor, unable to move and unable to call for help, because no one was in the barn. Michael found him 20 minutes later. Curtis was conscious but immobile, and the pain in his back was radiating down both legs in a way that indicated nerve involvement rather than simple muscle strain. Michael called for an ambulance, and Curtis was transported to the regional hospital in Council Bluffs, where Dr. Morrison examined him and ordered an MRI, and confirmed what the pain and the immobility suggested. The compression fracture at L4-L5 had worsened, and the vertebrae had shifted enough to impinge the nerve roots, and the prognosis was that Curtis would not regain full mobility without surgery, and even with surgery, there would be permanent restrictions. Dr. Morrison said, "Curtis, you need spinal fusion surgery. Without it, you are looking at progressive deterioration and possible permanent paralysis." Curtis said, "How long is recovery?" Dr. Morrison said, 8 weeks non-weight bearing, 6 months restricted activity, permanent lifting restriction 40 pounds maximum. Curtis said, "I have spring planting contracts, 1,800 acres, weather window opens in 6 days." Dr. Morrison said, "You are not planting anything. You are having surgery and you are recovering, and if you are fortunate, you will walk normally again by fall. If you ignore this and try to work, you will do permanent damage that no surgery can fix." Curtis said, "Who is going to run the operation?" Dr. Morrison said, "That is not a medical question. That is a business question. But from a medical perspective, you are done with physical farm work. Permanently." Curtis was admitted for surgery the following day. The procedure took 4 hours and involved fusing the L4 and L5 vertebrae with hardware and bone grafts. And when Curtis woke in recovery, the pain was different but not gone, and his ability to move his legs was limited by the surgical restrictions rather than by nerve damage, which meant the surgery had been successful in addressing the immediate crisis. He spent 3 days in the hospital and was released with instructions for bed rest and physical therapy and a wheelchair for mobility until the fusion healed enough to support weight bearing. Judith brought him home and set up the front room as a recovery space with a hospital bed and a walker, and all of the equipment that turning a healthy man into an invalid required. Curtis sat in the wheelchair and looked at the room and said, "How long did Morrison say?" Judith said, 8 weeks before you can put weight on it. 6 months before you are released to normal activity with restrictions." Curtis said, "Spring planting starts in 4 days." She said, "Michael is handling it." Curtis said, "Michael has his own contracts. He cannot handle mine too." Judith said, "He is going to try." Curtis said, "Trying is not the same as succeeding." She said, "Then we will find out what the difference is." Michael came to the house that evening and sat with Curtis, and they went through the planning board that Curtis had been maintaining in the barn. 1,800 acres contracted across 11 clients, 6 tractors allocated to the contracts, 4 operators available, Roy Dietrich and 2 hired men named Ed and Pete and Michael himself. The math was tight but possible if weather held and equipment performed and nothing broke. Curtis said, "You are taking on 3,200 acres total counting your own contracts." Michael said, "I know." Curtis said, "You have never managed that kind of volume." Michael said, "I have watched you manage it for 20 years. I know the logistics." Curtis said, "Knowing and doing are not the same thing." Michael said, "I know that too, but this is what we have. You cannot do the work I can, so I am going to do it." Curtis wanted to argue, but there was no argument to make because Michael was right. The contracts existed and the clients expected performance, and Curtis was in a wheelchair, and Michael was the only person who had the knowledge and the authority to run the operation. Curtis said, "The planning board is current through yesterday. Field sequence is optimized for weather and equipment. Radio check-ins every 2 hours. If something breaks, you call Frank Morrow for parts. Do not try to jury-rig repairs in the field." Michael said, "I know the protocols." Curtis said, "Knowing them and following them under pressure are different things." Michael said, "Dad, I have been doing this for 14 years. I know how to run a planting season." Curtis said, "You know how to run your operation. You have never run mine." Michael said, "Then I am about to learn." The weather window opened on May 18th, and Michael began the planting season running 4 tractors with 4 operators across 2 operations and 3,200 acres. Curtis monitored progress from the wheelchair in the front room via CB radio and via the phone calls that Michael made twice daily to report status. The first 3 days proceeded according to plan. Equipment performed. Operators maintained pace. By day 3, Michael had completed 900 acres and was on schedule to finish the full 3,200 in the projected 10-day window. On the morning of day 4, Michael called and said, "We have a problem." Curtis said, "What kind of problem?" Michael said, "The 1066 threw a rod. Engine is destroyed. Pete was running it in the Jensen field and it seized up and punched through the block." Curtis said, "Is Pete all right?" Michael said, "Pete is fine. Tractor is dead." Curtis said, "What is your equipment status?" Michael said, "I have 3 tractors down now counting the 1066. The Super M has a hydraulic leak I cannot isolate. The 856 has an electrical short that is draining the battery. I am running on 3 machines when I need 6. Curtis felt the tension building in his chest because 3 machines down simultaneously was the cascade failure scenario that he had documented in the equipment capital account ledger back in 1974, and that he had taught Michael about but that Michael had never experienced under actual pressure. Curtis said, "What are you doing about it?" Michael said, "I am trying to fix all 3 at once. I have been in the shop since 4 this morning." Curtis said, "Stop." Michael said, "What?" Curtis said, "Stop trying to fix all 3. You are spreading yourself too thin. Triage. Prioritize by repair time and field criticality. Fix the fastest repair first. Get that tractor back in service. Then move to the next." Michael said, "The 1066 is the most critical because Pete needs a machine." Curtis said, "The 1066 is not fixable. The engine is destroyed. You are not going to rebuild an engine during planting season. Write it off. Focus on the Super M and the 856. Which one can you fix faster?" Michael paused and Curtis could hear him thinking through the problem. Michael said, "The 856 electrical short is probably a loose ground. 30 minutes if I can find it." Curtis said, then start there. Get the 856 running, put Pete on it, then diagnose the Super M hydraulic leak. Do not try to do both simultaneously. Michael said, all right. Curtis said, and Michael, check the equipment capital account ledger. I documented a cascade failure in 1974. Read that entry. It will tell you what I did. Michael said, I will. The line went silent for a moment, and then Michael said, Dad, I am sorry. I should have been able to handle this without calling you. Curtis said, you handled it by calling me. That is what you are supposed to do when you do not know the answer. There is no shame in asking. Michael hung up, and Curtis sat in the wheelchair staring at the CB radio and feeling the helplessness that comes from being unable to act when action is required. He had built the operation with his own hands and his own knowledge, and now he was watching from a wheelchair while his son tried to hold it together under conditions that would have tested Curtis himself. He wanted to be in the barn diagnosing the hydraulic leak and finding the electrical short and sequencing the repairs the way he had done for 30 years. But he was not in the barn, and he would not be in the barn, and the operation would either survive without him, or it would not. Judith came into the room and said, how bad is it? Curtis said, 3 tractors down. Michael is trying to fix them all at once instead of sequencing the repairs. She said, did you tell him what to do? Curtis said, I told him to triage. Fix the fastest repair first. He is doing it now. She said, and if he cannot fix them? Curtis said, then we default on contracts and lose clients and damage reputation. But he will fix them. He knows how. He just panicked because he has never had 3 failures at once. Judith sat down and said, Curtis, you need to accept that you are not going to be running this operation anymore. Even after you recover, you will have lifting restrictions that will prevent you from doing the work. Michael is going to have to take over. Curtis said, I know. She said, do you? Because you are still trying to manage from a wheelchair. You are still monitoring the CB radio and taking his calls and telling him what to do. That is not transferring the operation. That is remote controlling it. Curtis said, he called me for help. What am I supposed to do, not help him? Judith said, you are supposed to help him by letting him make his own decisions and learn from his own mistakes. You cannot run this operation through him. It does not work that way. Curtis knew she was right, but accepting it was different from knowing it. He had built the operation on the principle that centralized decision-making was efficient, and that his judgment was reliable, and that delegating decisions meant accepting the risk that someone else's judgment would be wrong. But he was in a wheelchair, and his back would not allow him to return to physical work, and the operation would either continue under Michael's management, or it would not continue at all. He said, if he fails, it is not just his operation that fails. It is mine too. I have clients who have been with me for 20 years. If we default on their contracts, they will find other contractors and we will lose them permanently. Judith said, and if Michael succeeds despite the failures and the pressure, he will have earned the credibility to run the operation independently. You need to let him try. Curtis did not respond because there was nothing to say. Judith was right, and he would have to trust Michael, even though trust was harder than control, and control was what Curtis had relied on for 30 years. Michael called back 3 hours later. He said, the 856 is running. Loose ground at the starter solenoid. Pete is back in the field. Curtis said, good. What about the Super M? Michael said, hydraulic leak is the pump casing seal. I can replace it, but I need to pull the pump. That is 4 hours minimum. Curtis said, do you have a replacement seal? Michael said, I have one in parts inventory. I am pulling the pump now. Curtis said, Call me when it is back together." Michael said, "I will." Curtis hung up and sat in the wheelchair and allowed himself to think that Michael might actually succeed. The Cascade failure had been contained. The 856 was operational. The Super M was being repaired. The 1066 was a loss, but losses were acceptable within the margin that Curtis had built into the operation over the years. If Michael could get the Super M running by evening, the planting season would continue, and the contracts would be met, and the operation would survive. Michael called at 7:30 that evening. He said, "Super M is running. Seal replacement worked. No leaks. I am putting Roy on it for tomorrow." Curtis said, "How many acres did you lose today?" Michael said, 200. "We are half a day behind schedule, but I think we can make it up if nothing else breaks." Curtis said, "You did good work today." Michael said, "I followed your procedure. The ledger entry from 1974 was exactly what I needed. You documented the exact scenario I was in." Curtis said, "That is why I documented it, so you would have the knowledge when you needed it." Michael said, "I did not understand that until today. I thought the ledger was just accounting. But it is not. It is a decision support system. Every entry you made was teaching me how to handle situations I had not encountered yet." Curtis said, "That was the idea." Michael said, "Thank you." Curtis said, "You are welcome. Now finish the season." Michael finished the season. The weather held for the full 10 days, and Michael completed 3,200 acres with the reduced equipment capacity and the half-day delay. And when the last field was planted and the last tractor was returned to the barn, Michael called Curtis and said, "We are done. All contracts fulfilled. 0 defaults." Curtis felt something release in his chest that he had not known was holding. He said, "Good, you did it." Michael said, "We did it." Curtis said, "No, you did it. I was in a wheelchair. You ran the operation. You made the decisions. You recovered from the Cascade failure. That was you." Michael was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I could not have done it without the ledger, without the documentation you built over 30 years. That knowledge is what got me through." Curtis said, "The knowledge only works if you apply it. You applied it. That is what matters." In August of 1986, 3 months after the surgery, Curtis was released to limited weight-bearing activity. He could walk with a cane. He could stand for short periods. He could not lift anything over 40 pounds, and he could not operate equipment for full days without rest. Dr. Morrison said, "Curtis, you are never going to be physically capable of running a farm operation again. The fusion is stable, but the hardware is not designed for the kind of stress that farming puts on the spine. If you try to go back to full work, you will break the fusion, and then we are talking about wheelchair permanently." Curtis said, "What can I do?" Dr. Morrison said, "You can consult, you can plan, you can manage, but you cannot do physical work. That part of your life is over." Curtis drove home from the doctor's appointment and sat in the truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. He was 52 years old, and he had been farming since he was 18, and the idea that he would never operate a tractor again was difficult to accept. But acceptance was not optional. The back would not allow it, and trying to force it would result in outcomes worse than accepting it. He went inside and found Judith in the kitchen. He said, "Morrison says I am done with physical farm work, permanently." She said, "What did you expect him to say?" Curtis said, "I do not know. I hoped he would say I could return to light duty." She said, "Curtis, you can barely walk with a cane. Light duty is not realistic." He said, "I know." She sat down at the table, and Curtis sat across from her, and they were quiet for a moment. Then Judith said, "You need to transfer the operation to Michael formally. Legal documents, clear ownership. This is not about you retiring early. This is about making sure the operation continues." Curtis said, "I know." She said, "When?" He said, "Soon." Curtis met with an attorney in September, and the transfer documents were prepared. The operation would transfer to Michael, including all equipment, all contracts, all accounts, and all methodologies documented in the equipment capital account ledger. Curtis would retain an advisory role but would have no operational authority. The transfer was scheduled to take effect January 1, 1987. In November, Curtis called a meeting with Michael in the barn. He brought the equipment capital account ledger, the original green notebook from 1968, now joined by 5 additional notebooks that chronicled the 24 years since. He laid all 6 notebooks on the workbench and said, "These are yours now." Michael said, "I have been using them for planning." Curtis said, "I know. But now they are officially yours. The operation is yours. The equipment is yours. The knowledge in these notebooks is yours. What you do with it is your decision." Michael picked up the first notebook and opened it to the first page dated October 18, 1968. He read the first entry: Purchase Lot 23, Kemper Auction, 2 IH tractors, 1950M and 1953 Super M. Total cost $380. He looked at Curtis and said, "You started with $380. Curtis said, "I started with $380 and the willingness to fix what other people said was broken." Michael said, "And you built it into this." He gestured at the 16 tractors parked in the barn, the equipment that represented 24 years of methodical acquisition and repair and operation. Curtis said, "I built the foundation. You are going to build what comes next." Michael said, "What if I fail?" Curtis said, "You will not fail if you follow the method. Buy what you can pay for, repair it yourself. Do not borrow, document everything. The method works if you do not compromise it." Michael said, "What about the things the method does not cover, the decisions you make that are not in the notebooks?" Curtis said, "Those are judgment calls, and judgment comes from experience. You have the experience now. You ran 3,200 acres through a cascade failure and you finished on time. That is the kind of experience that tells you that you can handle what comes next." Michael said, "I am not you." Curtis said, "You are not supposed to be me. You are supposed to be better than me because you start with the knowledge I spent 30 years accumulating. You do not have to make the mistakes I made. You just have to avoid making new ones." Michael closed the notebook and said, "I will do my best." Curtis said, "That is all anyone can do." The formal transfer took effect on January 1, 1987. Michael became the owner and operator of the Brennan Custom Farming operation, and Curtis became the advisor who was consulted when Michael needed input, but who had no authority to make operational decisions. The arrangement required Curtis to let go of control in a way that was uncomfortable and unnatural, but that was necessary if the operation was going to continue. He had built something that survived the farm crisis, and that had proven the method worked, and now he had to trust that the method would continue to work under Michael's management. Through 1987 and 1988 and 1989, Michael ran the operation and proved that the transfer had been successful. Contracted acres grew from 1,800 to 2,200 to 2,600. Equipment was added through the same method Curtis had used, purchasing broken or unwanted machines at auctions and repairing them and adding them to the fleet. The equipment capital account ledger continued to be maintained with the same discipline Curtis had established, and the operation remained debt-free. Curtis watched from the advisory role and offered input when asked, but mostly stayed out of Michael's way. because Michael was demonstrating that he did not need Curtis's involvement to succeed. Curtis felt pride about this, but also a kind of displacement, because the operation he had built was no longer his, and the identity he had carried for 3 decades as the man who ran the largest custom farming operation in Shelby County was now transferred to his son. In the summer of 1990, Michael's son, David, turned 5 years old, and Michael brought him to the barn and began teaching him the same things Curtis had taught Michael. David learned how to organize tools on the workbench. He learned the names of the tractors and their model numbers. He learned to check oil levels and tire pressures and all of the small tasks that were the foundation of equipment maintenance. Curtis watched Michael teach David and saw the pattern repeating, the knowledge transferring from one generation to the next, and he understood that this was what he had been building all along, even if he had not articulated it that way. Curtis was 56 years old in 1990, and his back limited his activity, but did not prevent him from walking or from sitting in the barn and watching Michael work, or from answering David's questions about why tractors were painted red and why some had more wheels than others. Curtis found that he enjoyed the grandfather role more than he had expected to enjoy it, because it allowed him to participate in the operation without carrying the weight of responsibility, and because David's curiosity reminded Curtis of Michael at the same age, and of the questions Michael had asked that had led to the knowledge that was now being passed to David. On a Saturday in September of 1990, Curtis was in the barn with Michael and David. David was asking about the 2 tractors parked in the corner, a 1950 Farmall M and a 1953 Super M that had been semi-retired from active service, but that Curtis had kept because they were the original 2 from the Kemper auction in 1968. David said, "Grandpa, why do we keep these old ones?" Curtis said, "Because those 2 tractors are where everything started." David said, "What do you mean?" Curtis said, "In 1968, I bought those 2 tractors for $380 when everyone else said they were junk. I fixed them and I used them, and the money I made from them bought more tractors, and those tractors bought more tractors, and eventually we built all of this." He gestured at the barn and the equipment. David said, "So they are important." Curtis said, "They are proof." David said, "Proof of what?" Curtis said, "Proof that broken and worthless are not the same thing. A lot of people looked at those 2 tractors and saw junk. I looked at them and saw opportunity. The difference was that I spent 20 minutes looking and they spent 2 minutes looking. Those 20 minutes changed everything." David thought about this and then said, "What if you had only looked for 2 minutes?" Curtis said, "Then I would have walked away like everyone else did, and none of this would exist." Michael said, "Dad, tell him about Roy Dietrich." Curtis looked at Michael and then at David and said, "There was a man named Roy Dietrich who was at the same auction. He looked at those 2 tractors and he laughed at me for buying them. He said I was wasting my money. 20 years later, Roy was working for me as a hired operator because his own operation had failed and mine had not. The difference was those 2 tractors and the method they represented." David said, "What method?" Curtis said, "Buy what other people do not want, fix it yourself. Never borrow money, work hard, document everything. That is the method. It works if you do not compromise it." David said, "Did Mr. Dietrich compromise it?" Curtis said, "Mr. Dietrich borrowed money for new equipment, and the debt killed his operation when times got hard. That is what happens when you compromise the method." Michael said, "David, those 2 tractors are going to stay in this barn as long as we own this barn. They are not for sale. They are not for scrap. They are the foundation of everything we do, and we keep them so we never forget where we came from." David said, "I understand." Curtis did not know if David truly understood or if he was simply agreeing because that was what 5-year-old children did. But it did not matter because understanding would come with time and with experience, and with the repetition of seeing those two tractors every time he came to the barn, and eventually asking the questions that would lead to the understanding. The method transferred through repetition and through documentation, and through the patient answering of questions, and Curtis had done that for Michael, and Michael would do that for David, and the knowledge would persist across generations, as long as someone cared enough to maintain it. In November of 1991, Curtis sat with Michael in the barn going through the planning board for the 1992 season. Michael's contracted acres for 1992 were projected at 2,800. The equipment fleet had grown to 18 tractors. The equipment capital account showed a balance of $3,100. Total debt remained zero. Curtis said, "You have built this beyond where I had it." Michael said, "I had a foundation to build on. You gave me that." Curtis said, "The foundation is the method. You applied it. That is what matters." Michael said, "I am thinking about bringing David into the operational work in a few years, not just maintenance, actual field operations, planning, logistics." Curtis said, "He is 6. Michael said, "I know, but by the time he is 12 or 13, he could be running support the way I did for you. By 16, he could be operating equipment. By 20, he could be managing his own contracts." Curtis said, "That is the pattern. Each generation starts earlier because they have access to the knowledge the previous generation built." Michael said, "Do you think the method will work for him the way it worked for us?" Curtis said, "The method will work for anyone who applies it with discipline. The market does not care who you are. The market cares whether you control costs and whether you deliver results. If you do both, the method works." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Curtis said, "I am proud of what you have done with this operation. I want you to know that." Michael said, "Thank you." Curtis said, "When I was in the wheelchair in 1986 and you were running both operations, I was terrified that you would fail and that everything I had built would collapse. But you did not fail. You succeeded despite the pressure and despite the cascade failure, and that is when I knew that the transfer would work." Michael said, "I almost failed. The cascade failure nearly broke me." Curtis said, "But it did not. You adapted. You called me for help when you needed it, and you implemented the solution, and you finished the season. That is what the method is about, not avoiding failure, managing it when it happens." Michael said, "I understand that now." Curtis said, "Then you understand everything you need to know." Curtis closed the notebook and stood and walked slowly to the barn door, using the cane that he would carry for the rest of his life. He looked back at the line of tractors, 18 machines representing 29 years of methodical acquisition and repair, and he felt something close to satisfaction, though satisfaction was not a word he used often because satisfaction implied completion, and the work was never complete as long as equipment needed maintenance and fields needed planting. But if satisfaction was the wrong word, then perhaps validation was the right one. The method had worked. The operation had survived the farm crisis that destroyed larger and better funded operations. The knowledge had transferred to the next generation. The two original tractors from 1968 still sat in the corner of the barn as proof that broken things could be fixed if you knew how to look at them and had the discipline to do the work. Curtis Brennan had been right in October of 1968 when he bought two tractors that everyone else dismissed. He had been right about the method and right about the discipline and right about the mathematics of buying broken things and fixing them and never borrowing money to do it. The proof was in the barn. The proof was in the ledgers. The proof was in Michael and in David, and in the operation that would continue after Curtis was gone, because the knowledge was documented, and the method was transferable and broken, things were still not the same as worthless things. That was the whole story, and it had been visible from the beginning to anyone who was willing to spend 20 minutes looking.